Wrong.
Wrong.
Seriously.
Wrong.
And it sounds right.
Wrong.
I made a mistake.
Wrong.
Wrong. Completely wrong.
Wrong. Seriously.
Wrong.
No, seriously.
Wrong. Wrong. Seriously. Wrong.
Wrong. Completely wrong.
Wrong. Wrong.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Seriously Wrong podcast. This week, we are joined by comedian and activist Kate Willett. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
And we are also joined, as always, I'm Sean, by wonderful co-host Aaron.
Hey, yeah, I'm here too. I like how you said we're joined by Sean. We're all joining each other here. We're all joined. Beautiful union coming together.
That is so true. And we're talking today about the housing crisis, Nimbys and yimbys, social housing, supply arguments, etc.
Yeah, this episode we're going to get to the bottom of the age-old question of when dealing with this escalating housing crisis that we've been facing for, a few decades now, is the way to get more homes to people who are homeless, who are minimum wage, who are working poor, who are having trouble affording rents, is the way to get them more housing to simply get out of the developer's way and let them produce whatever they want, which is usually market rate housing, i.e. the most you can possibly charge in a market, or is the way to build purpose-built social housing for lower middle, working poor, minimum wage people. Spoiler alert, we all think it's the second one.
This episode of Seriously Wrong is brought to you by Market Housing Footwear. It's raining out there, and it's raining hard. That rain is like a metaphor for the housing crisis. And everyone's saying, boots, boots, we need boots. In this case, affordable housing. Boots, boots, boots. And we at Market Rate Footwear, we heed the call. You want boots, so we're going to increase the supply of shoes without adjectives.
Supply, supply, supply.
And our internal metrics show that making sandals is most profitable for us. Those cheap boots you want would make a profit, but they're sort of suboptimal margin. So our idea is that if everyone buys lots of sandals, then the boots will trickle down.
If you fill your closet up with sandals, eventually there's going to be no more room for boots. So you're going to sell those boots on the Facebook marketplace, and that will cause the availability of boots being resold to skyrocket because everyone will have so many sandals.
It's actually the best way to get dry feet for everyone, is just make it as easy as possible to produce and distribute sandals.
Exactly.
And that's how you solve the wet feet crisis.
The boots will trickle down.
Market Rate Housing Footwear, proud sponsor of Seriously Wrong. Now back to the show. Kate, this is an area of interest for you. You're someone who is active on social media talking about these issues. What brought you to your interest in this subject matter?
So I lived in San Francisco at like the peak of the tech boom. And in San Francisco in 2008, it was a city, it was expensive, but you could rent a room for $700. There were a lot of people who were unemployed. If you were willing to not eat at restaurants and buy your clothes in a thrift store, that you could get by pretty easily. And then the tech boom started popping off. All these companies, Facebook, Google, they just started hiring a bajillion employees. And instead of those employees living in the peninsula, like Silicon Valley, Mountain View and stuff, they lived in San Francisco and took a bus down to Mountain View or San Jose. And so all of a sudden, there was just like all of these competition for apartments. And it became like a really wild situation that you can still see today where, landlords were jacking up their rent. They'd get like 100% rent increase. And there is some rent control in San Francisco, but it doesn't apply to a lot of the buildings there. The eviction laws in San Francisco, like There was like a landlord arson spree. Basically, like nobody knows like actually what happened, but it seemed like landlords were setting fire to their buildings to be able to evict the tenants and, do condo conversions to get around the tenant laws and stuff. And, it became a really antagonistic relationship between tech and the rest of the city. A lot of businesses were closing, theaters, beloved bars and art institutions. And it was just kind of like this super accelerated gentrification. There was like this famous story of like all these tech bros that had made a reservation for like a field at a park, a soccer field, and they went there and they tried to kick the little kids off the field because they're like, you don't have a reservation to play there. And the kids were like, what the hell? We've been playing here our whole lives, and it was this kind of like battle of who does this city belong to. And, I lost my housing during that time. I was renting a house with like 5 other people, and the rent was like around $3,600 for the total. And it was like a house. It was kind of far from things. It wasn't even like a central area. But, the landlord just jacked it up to like $6,000 a month or something very close to it. And, I was like, is this legal? And turns out it completely was. So I really had a hard time finding like an affordable place to live. And I also had a lot of resentment towards the tech guys that came in and started treating everybody like shit, to be honest, and I sort of forgot about it. I actually moved to New York, and like I was very happy to leave that tech monoculture behind. And, I've been political for a while, but it's kind of been more electoral focused. Like I'll canvass or phone bank for like socialist candidates for office and stuff. But then around 2022, I ended up tweeting something that was a back and forth with one of my mutuals about just, how housing prices in San Francisco were really expensive, and this community of like weird guys like swarmed me, and it didn't really seem like it would be like something that people would get mad about. It was like, yeah, the rent's too high. Like that's not really a super unusual opinion these days, but I was just like, who are these guys? And then I looked into it and I found out about the YIMBY movement, kind of a new politics of housing. Like there's traditionally with housing, maybe pre 2015, there's been like a few different groups. There's like the homeowners who I think, broadly have a set of interests, although it can vary a lot. Like, working class homeowners can be pretty sympathetic to like tenants' rights and stuff. So it's not all one thing, but there's like, homeowners, and then there's like landlords and tenants. And, you saw people like, advocating for more sort of traditional tenants' rights stuff like rent control. And I discovered this group of yimbys that were like, they have a theory that, what's good for developers is basically the exact same thing that's in the tenant interest. And it's like, with that kind of situation, you follow the money on it, and so I did. And I realized there's some pretty weird people like pouring money into this movement that is sort of semi-astroturfed and semi-organic. And, I ended up getting like more involved in housing politics in my city. I still probably mostly do like electoral activism, but I was like basically this group of tech guys that came in, and I felt like just kind of took everyone's housing in San Francisco and then tried to put all the people that they made homeless in jail, which is a weird thing to talk about on the day of the Grants Pass ruling, because they literally they wrote and signed like amicus briefs in that case. I was like, holy shit, like these people have organized themselves into a political movement, and that's not good.
So YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard. And if you criticize YIMBYs on the internet, you'll often be called a NIMBY, a not in my backyard person. I was looking up where the term NIMBY comes from, and it seems like the earliest written records of it treat it as a common sense kind of thing, that it sprung up sometime in the mid 1970s. In the late 70s, early 80s, you start seeing people talk about the NIMBY syndrome, the not in my backyard syndrome. But I was really fascinated to see some of the earliest, in the context of the YIMBY debates, is talking about housing, and specifically market rate housing. But in the earliest examples of NIMBY as a term and YIMBY as a term that I could find. They were actually talking about industrial waste and nuclear waste.
Yep.
So I guess, can you respond to the accusation that you're some sort of the accusation that you're a NIMBY, that you don't support the development of new housing, that this opposition to YIMBYism is a desire to restrict housing supply and benefit landowners?
No, I'm definitely not a NIMBY. I'll address that in like the quickest way first and then a little more complicated. So as you said, like I think that the first use of NIMBY had something to do with industrial waste. And it sounds like the people there had a pretty good reason for opposing it. But then as that term got more prevalent, it started to just apply to anyone not wanting new housing or even like stuff like homeless shelters or schools in their neighborhood, anyone who opposes development. But the kind of stereotype of it is like a wealthier white person that doesn't want Black and brown neighbors moving into their area. And, like both for racist reasons and also because by restricting supply, property values are higher. So, it has really negative association. I am not a property owner. I mean, other like my cell phone and my computer and stuff, but I'm a renter. I'm a working class person. And, my opposition to the free market housing plan has come from both my socialist beliefs and also really, looking at a lot of research and seeing that unless we build specifically affordable housing, like as in housing that is either social housing or have like rent control, or there's some other ways that we can talk about like inclusionary zoning. But basically, like my opposition to YIMBYism is rooted in a belief, and I think one that I have some empirical data on, that there is not a free market solution to the housing crisis. Although, market building can help in some circumstances, and a lack of market building, that is part of how we got into this, situation. I think that those things like a low supply of housing, or not enough for people, like you can see like Engels writing about that back in the day. And, it wasn't because of like European zoning ordinances. It's inherent to capitalism. And, I think that the use of the term YIMBY, was, as you were describing, like just kind of like a rarely used term, very rarely used term that was seen as like a development specific thing. Like you could be YIMBY or NIMBY on a specific development, and it's still used that way. But when I use it, most of the time I'm talking about an organized group of these kind of nonprofits that have a lot of tech funding behind them, that are lobbyists for influencing housing policy. And they have organic members, but they're also very much like they're billionaire funded, and they're, getting donations from the real estate industry, from tech, which in San Francisco is really tied up with the real estate industry. And it's like, it's a name for a movement now, and that was on purpose. They named themselves that because YIMBY sounds like the opposite of NIMBY. And, that it just, they're like, oh, okay, well, that's a good thing to be. But I would say that NIMBY and YIMBY, like, it's all working in a capitalist framework. And my argument, would be that you should be a socialist and favor at least some degree of public solution to our housing crisis, because not only because it's like morally correct, but also because it's literally the only way that we could get everyone in housing. Otherwise there's just like a lot of problems of like, there'll be, really expensive luxury apartments sitting empty while other people are sleeping on the street. Like, so, I think it's just also the only way it can work.
Yeah, the YIMBY versus NIMBY thing, it's like a really effective framing method for presenting people with, oh, there's these two options out there. And the NIMBY is usually framed as the bad one, and YIMBY is usually framed as the good one. It's a way of like narrowing the scope of the debate, as presenting it as if there's just these two sides to it. And like one side is like these old neighborhood homeowners who don't want the quote unquote character of their neighborhood to change. Maybe they want single family dwellings to stay that way and not build any multiple family units or anything like that. Or maybe they're just concerned about poor people or racialized people moving into their neighborhood. And, obviously they're bad. But this other side wants to build. So they're like obviously good. But when what they're talking about building most of the time is, as you're pointing out, is like luxury units, or like basically whatever developers want to build, whatever developers think will make them the most amount of money. Then it's just like you're just talking about two different groups of capitalists arguing with each other over like housing policy, and neither side is really representing the interests of tenants, basically, but people who don't have enough money to afford housing in all the major cities in the world right now. You're talking about San Francisco. We both live in Vancouver, which is one of the least affordable housing markets in the world, certainly in Canada. And I mean, the only reason I can still live in my apartment is because we have some rent control stuff set up where like I moved in 11 years ago and they've only been able to raise the rent by so much. And if I move anywhere, it would have to be out of Vancouver proper, at least.
The building I'm in was actually built with public subsidy to have below market units, quote unquote, which in Vancouver, below market units is for people who earn $45,000 to $98,000 a year. The middle income units are called below market units. But in this type of build that I'm in, that rent control only applies to the first people who move in. And then when they move out, they can jack up the rents as much as they want. So I actually moved in the second wave after some people who moved out. So I was paying market rent at the time when I first moved in like 5 years ago. But now I just found out that my neighbor's moving out, and the place that they're leaving, the rent is being jacked up by, I think, 60 or 70%. Between tenancies. So the next person who moves in is going to be paying in 70% more than they were paying. Yeah, like I was pulled into thinking about the politics of the housing crisis for really similar reasons to you, Kate, in that we're in this overheated housing market and you see all these political debates happening on what should happen. And I always find it so obnoxious, some of these, and it's not just yimbys, and some of the people who are organic yimbys or whatever, they're nice enough people, and I don't want to attack people too hard, but this super marketeer kind of like language and logic around things, and like this overconfidence that comes from invoking stuff like supply and demand on not just the housing issue, but also like any sort of political issue where people are making these like really confident assertions about economic principles, Econ 101 kind of stuff. That's always been like nails on a chalkboard to me, and is actually part of the reason why I became so fascinated in the wonkish details of how housing policy works and stuff, was because what they were claiming I just knew was wrong, and I need to disprove it.
Yeah.
And through that became an advocate for social housing and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's like these guys are all like Econ 101, and I'm like, well, you need to maybe take Econ 102,
Yeah.
like it's just more complicated than they say it is. I think a couple distinctions that are important to make at the beginning of any conversation is if I say the term luxury housing, like that's a term that they would get really mad about, by the way. But what I mean by that is the most you could possibly charge in any given market. And that is most of what gets produced, because obviously, for-profit developers have a huge incentive to make the most money possible. Also, I think another thing that's important to distinguish is that yimbys they're not building housing. So, I mean, except for the ones that literally are developers, but there's not a one-for-one relationship between like what a yimby is advocating for and, producing new units of housing. What they're advocating for specifically, at least in the United States, I don't know how it works in Canada, but in the US, all of our conversations about this are about upzoning. And upzoning means changing the zoning ordinances to allow for more units. So for example, like rezoning a single family neighborhood for apartments. And that is often a good thing to do. It's not bad, especially when you see some of these like fancy ass neighborhoods like Westchester in New York. They just voted to take, Jamal Bowman out of office. And like in general, it's just shitty to have these single family neighborhoods full of people that want to keep others out. So I don't think upzoning is bad, but it's more complicated than just upzone and then new housing gets created, because there are other factors in producing new market rate housing. One is interest rates. Another one is materials costs. Another one is labor costs, labor supply. To produce at the level that yimbys want to, we would basically always have to have like 0% interest rates and completely transform our economy to a construction-based economy. And developers would have to, for some reason, not stop building when there's, an oversupply. And we do see that happen, like sometimes kind of by accident, like in Austin, when they built a lot of housing in Austin because there was an anticipation that way more people were going to move to that area than actually did. But, once they figured out that they overshot a little bit, they stopped building. And so the idea that like developers will just keep building in any circumstance as long as you upzone is not really true. So it's like, when they talk and they say like, yeah, we just want to build housing, no, what you want to do is upzone and hope that produces more housing. And sometimes it does, but there's also plenty of instances where we see lots that have the correct zoning permissions that are sitting empty, especially when interest rates are really high.
Yeah, no, this is my notes too, that upzoning isn't the same as development. And there's examples of places that did a bunch of upzoning and then it didn't result in development because of these secondary factors, things like land values and construction costs. I've debated with some yimbys about this. I don't really understand their argument. They didn't really source it well. But my understanding is that the places that have the highest land values also have the highest construction costs, because the cost of construction has within it encoded the costs of rent, or the costs of property values and so on for the people who supply the materials, the labor and stuff. They need to have offices. So there's all this baked in land value and all this baked in land cost, which raises construction in the hottest markets because the costs of construction and labor increase because laborers need to be able to pay the rents of the inflated housing market. So it's this kind of unvirtuous cycle that makes it more expensive to build. And then I think like the solution is, if we can't guarantee that upzoning results in development and our goal is development, then what we need to have is a public developer that is tasked with building, that builds for public use and builds for social use, because that's something that you don't have to, there's so much game of like trying to, it's like being a snake charmer or something for developers, like, oh, I'll give you, if you build for us, we'll give you this and we'll give you this, and we're going to cut the inclusionary zoning requirements and we're going to give you more density.
If you include 7% quote unquote affordable housing, but it's defined as affordable based on a metric that is like most people, like the median income people, actually can't afford it, but it's just like we call it affordable based on some like obscure metric that doesn't make any sense, and like, then you can build a building, or we'll approve your permit if you build like these few units of not actually affordable housing in the midst of the other like luxury top market rate housing.
And there's something so credulous about it too, of just like, oh, if we only give them what they want, they'll build for us. Like, just take them at their face value. They're like, we can't build at that level. It's too expensive. And we're like, oh, we're so sorry. Here, let's make it more affordable for you by cutting all your requirements. And like, if you do that, then it's just going to be kicked up the road. They're going to try to get a better and better deal. They're going to be like, housing supply is so important, we can't afford to build it. You need to give us money and handouts so we can build market price supply for your community that we own and profit off of. Like, the treadmill of what they ask for evolves over time, where they're going to ask for more and more and more. And we can't just like be like, oh, I'm so sorry, developers, take it all. Like, you're the heroes of our society. Here, take my wallet. It's just not going to work.
Yeah. And, the relationship that we should be having with the real estate industry in our town is an oppositional one. Like, yimbys would call that NIMBYism, but it's not. To me, we should be extracting the maximum amount of public benefit from developers, whether that comes in the form of taxes or whether, they provide other benefits to the community, like schools and parks, but like, or affordable units. Like that's another one that sometimes happens in the form that you're talking about, which is inclusionary zoning, basically like saying, if you have a building with 100 units, 10 of them have to be affordable, but affordable, as you said, has a very nebulous definition. It's often a percentage of area median income. I think in New York, 130% of median income can count as affordable. And what that ends up being is you have to make like over $100,000 a year to $200,000 a year to like qualify for the affordable housing. And it's like, okay, great sarcastically, but we could extract potentially better concessions from them and have like truly affordable units. Sometimes people call that deeply affordable. There's a lot of ideas for like how to do this and how to get more out of developers than we're getting now, to build public housing, to have communities that are like cohesive and nice for people. And to me, like an important thing to understand is that the interests of the developer are not the same as the interests of people in the neighborhood. Sometimes they will be aligned, but sometimes it won't be aligned. And just taking everything that developers say at face value of like, oh, it doesn't pencil out if we offer some affordable housing, or actually, yeah, you have to give us a tax abatement for 30 years. We can't do this. It's like, okay, open up the books and show us, because there's never any proof demanded of this stuff. A lot of times when they promise to deliver community benefit or, affordable housing benefit, they don't deliver it. There's no enforcement mechanism because the politicians who would be responsible for issuing that fine or, withholding approval for the next project, they are paid off by those developers. So to me, like, this is where like socialism helps, to have like a class struggle based understanding of housing. In the YIMBY theory and worldview, what's good for developers is automatically good for people. The interests are one and the same. So something like, rent control or, anti-eviction laws, other protections for tenants, like they will see those most of the time as not being good for tenants because they don't benefit the developer, which means that there's going to be less housing and then prices are going to be, higher and stuff. But it is just really more, it's just really more complicated than that.
Yeah. And as advocates, I think we should be really suspicious of the claim that the interests of developers, landlords, and landholders are the same as the interests of tenants. And as tenant activists, we should make sure that we always have a counter proposal, our own narrative, our own line that we can push back against these narratives.
All right, so we were thinking about how there's this false dichotomy between YIMBY and NIMBY.
Yeah,
that the
booing and cheering.
Booing and cheering development are the only two possible positions. So we thought, let's think outside of the box here a little bit. Let's throw on a bit of jazz music.
Just to get the juices flowing.
Just to start some lateral thinking here. Let's come up with some clever acronyms that are just as catchy as YIMBY and NIMBY for alternative positions in this debate.
Both these positions are so busted. They just need to be outcompeted with. And here, I'll just put on this music. They just need to be outcompeted with. And the only way we're going to do that is catchy acronyms that confront them. So first, I've for a long time felt like I was an yimbys. It depends in my backyard because there's a really big difference between chemical waste and safe injection sites. I support safe injection sites in my backyard. Maybe not literally in my backyard, but relatively close to my house.
I think in general with these acronyms, the in my backyard part, it's very rarely literally just the backyard. It's usually like in my neighborhood. Or...
Yeah, and often it's not even necessarily my neighborhood. Like yimbys are in favor of other people's backyards being developed too.
Inaccurate acronyms to begin with. But yeah, I think yimbys, that makes a lot of sense because it does depend. You don't want to be a quimby, a chemical waste in my backyard advocate.
No, yeah. And I think most yimbys aren't, even if they accidentally might imply that they are.
Yeah, just saying yes in my backyard means what? You want everything in your backyard? You want murder in my backyard? Mimby?
I think a couple years back, Vancouver had a party that was called Yes, and they wanted to build a bunch of housing, and their name was Yes.
Yeah, no, see, that's too broad for me. I'd never just make a yes movement, broadly yes to everything. Cause
yeah, it's true. It's true. It's funny.
I assume that they would also say no to certain things.
Oh, yeah, no, of course.
To be fair.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you want to get really direct with what's needed, I think shimby, social housing in my backyard.
Yeah, as opposed to Marambi, which is market rate apartments in my backyard.
Yeah, so shimby is obviously the superior acronym there, rolls off the tongue. And I mean, that's an argument against market rate housing and in favor of social housing, in my opinion.
How much it rolls off the tongue is going to be important here.
Limby, libraries in my backyard. I'm just saying, rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, that's true.
And we could do with more libraries.
Quimby, chemical waste. I'd be an anti-Quimby or Naquimby against chemical waste in my backyard or neighborhood, or even other people's neighborhoods, which would be Nukwai open, which is no chemical waste in other people's neighborhoods.
An alternative to shimby that I also like, that also rolls off the tongue, is uhimby, universal housing in my backyard.
Public housing, Fimby.
Yeah, the PH making the F sound is always fun in all the time whenever that comes up.
No, I'm
so.
pleased to find that for sure.
So Fimby, yeah, it would just be a lot of fun to be in that movement. The only downside I could see is people being Fimby. You mean fires in my backyard? I don't want fires in my backyard. And you'd be like, no, it's PH, it's not F.
That short's
Public housing.
Public housing. Oh, Shimby. Why don't you just say Shimby?
But I think you were onto something earlier when you mentioned IOPN as an alternative ending to these things
in other people's
neighborhoods. Because as we were saying, it's not always in my backyard that we're talking about. A lot of the times it's IB in your backyard is what people are actually talking about, or in other people's neighborhoods, or across the planet. Sometimes ATP is really what people are talking about. If I was saying, I want no pollution across the planet.
What is that?
Napatup, which some people say doesn't roll off the tongue, but
No,
I say
totally
it totally
disagree.
does. Napatup. And people say you can't have a good acronym with only one vowel in there.
Yeah, disproven. So if naive before, now dishonest. What if we, instead of in my backyard, we could recontextualize it as on the unceded territories of Indigenous peoples? Here in Vancouver, it is definitely the case that we're on unceded territories of Indigenous people.
Yeah, so when you're talking about making these decisions about what to say yes to and what to say no to, it's kind of a lie to just frame it as my backyard when what we're talking about is on the unceded territories of Indigenous people.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of, maybe we could frame this whole thing around our ultimate goals instead of this short-term dispute and say yes in a decolonized and decommodified utopian paradise.
Right.
Yided up.
Yided up or nided up. See, I would be a yided up in that case, because pretty much anything that could exist in a decolonized and decommodified utopian paradise, I would say yes to. Because in order for the suffix to hold true, whatever you're saying yes to has to be good.
Just to play devil's advocate, laterally thinking here as the jazz has been encouraging. If we're talking about a new policy from a decolonized and decommodified utopian paradise, and the Y in this instance refers to market rate apartments in my backyard, and you're adding market rate apartments into a society that has somehow managed to not have them and is a utopian paradise, then you could argue that...
Yeah, I guess you could say yes to something in a utopian paradise that dismantles part of the utopia.
Yeah, that gets off the tracks of utopian paradise.
Yeah, I was saying yes to anything that moves us towards a utopian paradise. So yes to anything that moves... Yitat mud I did up. Yeah, no, that one's not gonna... We're gonna have to work on that one.
Yitatmapidadup. Just say it a few times. It will start rolling off the tongue.
Yeah, maybe I was too quick to say no to that.
Yitatmapidadup. It actually's got a little rhythm to it. Which is yes to anything that moves us towards a decolonized and decommodified utopian paradise. All my issues with Yimby are definitely dealt with there, and we kept yes.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, if you're a fan of the backyard stuff, sorry, this isn't...
Yeah, honestly, backyards in general probably got to go, like single family backyard. Maybe if you live... There's probably certain places with low populations where single family homes are still a super viable way to organize your neighborhood or whatever. But in big cities, we probably need to abolish backyards. We could have joint backyards, like a building has a little space, a little backyard for the people in the building, or green spaces in between social housing buildings that are shared and create little mini communities. Obviously, that's kind of more what you want rather than backyards, which are fine in some contexts, but if you're really closed in on space, everybody getting their own little privatized lawn, it's just not feasible. just to problematize the idea of the backyard in general. If you want to have your own backyard, I think you got to move away from population centers.
EYOB Yehitmefpk. It stands for, if you want your own backyard, you have to move away from population centers.
That's just common sense, honestly. Well, maybe some of those ideas will last the test of time. Some of them won't. It's hard to say when you're just having a jazz session like this and throwing out ideas, a little brainstorming.
Let's just turn off that jazz. Okay, let's lock it in. What are you?
You know,
Someone says, I'm a yimby or I'm a nimby. What are you? Pick a side.
I'm gonna go with shimby just because I think it's the closest to the other two.
Yeah.
And the other things we said, we gotta move the conversation forward before we can start introducing some of that stuff.
That's true.
We're really advanced beyond the discourse right now.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
we got to start where
But we've
they
got
are.
a path ahead of us, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
unambiguous. But, I'm also a shited up social housing in a decolonized and decommodified utopian paradise.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a great continuity between my shimby activism and my shited up activism. Because
both for social housing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us what kind of acronym you are out there in the audience.
Pimby, Limby, Grimby, Zimby. You could be, it's up to you. That's a beautiful thing about life and living in a society which cherishes individualism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's more to politics than booing and cheering. There's this realm of qualitative difference, like of vibrant, cascading difference. And that is what politics is. I read a really great book called The Tenant Class by Ricardo Tranjan, and it's really brilliant. People should definitely check it out on the class war front and on the interest front. He points out that the housing crisis as it currently exists is not an accident. It's not like, whoopsie, our market isn't working. This market is working exactly as how it's set up to work, which is that tenants and landlords have different interests. Landlords' interest is to soak the tenants for as much rent as possible. And tenants are in a structurally unequal relationship with landlords where they are exploited, where their rent pays off the assets of the landowning class, where tenants are deprived of the same rights in society that landowners are, and that tenants are effectively treated as second-class citizens where they're paid lower wages and they pay a higher percentage of their income for housing costs, and their rent ultimately goes down to pay off the assets and build capital for the capital owning class. So tenants and landlords don't want the same thing. It's like even a good landlord with a good heart structurally wants to make as much money as possible off of their land holding. It's only natural. And tenants, they want to have cheap rents. So the capital Y YIMBY frame, that supply is the answer to this question, that giving developers more opportunities and investors more opportunities to produce more housing, which is market rent, soaking tenants for what the market will bear at that time. And that is going to create like a second tier process where this filtering is what they call it, where, you build expensive apartments and then it causes the rich people to leave the poor people's apartments, and the poor people's apartments are free and open for people who have less income. This is like part of the theory of YIMBYism. And I think any common sense person can see like there's something wrong with that picture. That doesn't really make sense. If you're talking about a strategy for affordability and you're saying we have to build 15,000 units of $4,000 a month rental housing, and it's going to trickle up through the market, and it's going to free up all this old housing stock and make it cheap for people, I think tenants should be smart enough to call bullshit on that.
I do too. And I think that calling bullshit on it is important, but I think it's also important to understand that they're not completely incorrect. So filtering, it is a real thing. It does work sometimes. Like what you're saying, that basically, you build for the millionaires move, into the new places. And then the people who are just regular rich move into the millionaire's old house. And then the upper middle class person moves into the home of someone that was regular rich, and like just basically all the way down through what sometimes gets called submarkets of housing. And, basically like it results in everyone having a home. And, filtering, it is a real process. There's just kind of a lot that can go wrong with it. One, if new people move to an area, like in a place like New York, let's just take the city that I live in, just sort of an infinite demand to live in New York. Like it's not It's not like the amount of people who live in New York is like in any way fixed. There's also rich people who want to buy second and third homes. There's landlords that are willing to leave stuff vacant. And let's say, there's two friends that live together in a place, and, then basically that those people would move out and not become roommates anymore. So, now there's 2 units that are taken up, and basically like, there's so many places where the like filtering process can get messed up, and including just like when you're talking about people who are rent burdened, as in like already paying more than like 25 or 30% of their rent. Like those people may not choose to move to more expensive housing. Like the process of filtering requires that everybody make a choice to move somewhere a little nicer. But, if you're talking about people that are already stretched in a capitalist society, like people may decide like, hey, I'm going to continue living in this kind of shitty place so that I can save money for retirement, for my child's college education. And just like by the time it gets all the way down to like the bottom, it either takes a really long time or the benefit is pretty small, or, it never really makes it all the way. So, in Austin, for example, which is like a place that yimbysm worked, it's like their case study. Like in Austin, the developers did build a lot of housing, and they built a little too much housing, which is like the yimby dream. So you saw like, all these fancy schmancy apartments offering like, a month free, and the people towards the top of the income ladder did end up getting some pretty good deals. And there were also some benefits for people whose houses that they moved out of, and like filtering did happen there. However, when you get down to like the apartments that are like truly affordable, like the ones that someone needs to live somewhere that costs like $1,000, like those people did not get much benefit. Like it didn't really help them that much, and sometimes made the costs a little higher, especially for like the housing that's supposed to be like officially affordable housing, where the price is mandated by a percentage of area median income. When you have a lot of new rich people move into an area, the median income changes, and so then their rent goes from $1,000 to $1,500, and maybe they can't pay it, and they get pushed out of the city altogether. So it just ended up being a thing where like filtering happened. It was beneficial certainly to like upper middle class people and rich people, and it was somewhat beneficial to people just like kind of in the pure middle. But then by the time it got to like people that are making, I'm just throwing a number out there, I'm not saying, I don't know if this is like an exact figure, but people basically in like the bottom half of earners, it started to look a lot less beneficial. And with filtering, it's like, it's not a completely fake process or anything. Like it happens, and it's written about in all housing textbooks, but like the overwhelming majority of the benefit of it will be received at the top, and then with diminishing returns as you go sort of down the income ladder.
Well, yeah, in order for it to benefit people at the bottom of the ladder, you need the rent to not be increased between tenants. It assumes that these old units aren't going to be moving up to market price over time, which landlords are going to have a tendency to want to do.
Yeah, and that's a hot section of debate. That's a hot topic. Yeah.
I mean, I live in an old building that, like, I know the units that people who haven't lived here 10 years are paying, like, almost double than what I'm paying. And it's not affordable. Not anything I would consider affordable. If I had to make the definition of affordable, it would probably be tied to minimum wage. And, like, what could a minimum wage person afford? You know, something like 25% of a minimum wage person. That seems like where affordability should be pegged. But I saw some research about filtering saying that in places like, they use San Francisco as an example, and there was some other report, the LAD report was advocating 15,000 new units be built every year in order to create filtering in San Francisco. And this research from UC Berkeley found that if you did that, they believed that rent would likely drop about 0.3% annually, and that after 30 years, there might be more affordability for some middle income people. So it's basically what you're saying. The benefits all go to the top half of the market, and It's like a really slow, minute process of like slight decreases if you're building a ton of things. And like building 15,000 new units in San Francisco every year is like, yeah, like you were saying before, there's all these other limits on construction and like how much construction can actually happen or is affordable or is profitable for developers. Like, are they going to want to build 15,000 new units, even if you're giving them the best zoning deals ever and the best tax write-offs on their bill? Like, probably not.
Yeah, I've seen similar studies that basically suggest, if we did a truly unprecedented amount of construction, we, times it by 10 or whatever, that there might be a tiny rent decrease. It's more likely that the rents would just go up a little bit less fast, and it's like,
that's what some of the studies call that rent decreases. So like if you actually read some of the yimbys studies, they say that a rent decrease, basically
a decrease in the rate of increase is
the rent increasing less counts as a decrease, and that's easier to prove. So it's easier to achieve.
So like, one thing that we kind of touched on that is like a very hot topic of debate among yimbys and, socialists like ourselves, and kind of like research versus like lived experience is like, if you build a bunch of new luxury housing next to like an older building where people maybe have affordable deals that they've lived in a long time, does the rent go up or down? And there are a couple studies that, say that like doesn't raise the rent. There's a study that gets like cited a lot by Anthony Damiano, and he had another study partner that basically said like, if you build a lot of housing, new supply, it kind of depends on like submarkets. So like kind of like what we were saying before, it will like basically lower the price of similarly priced apartments. Like luxury housing will lower the price of other luxury housing in the neighborhood, but for like people who are at the bottom of the income ladder, it might actually make their rent go up a little bit. And he showed that it did go up a little bit, not a huge amount, but then they have other studies showing that there's actually no rent increase for people who are living in affordable housing. That basically new supply either doesn't affect the rent or it makes it always go down. But there's not a ton of studies on this. Like there's probably like 5 or 6 that people cite a lot. And there's also like all of these kind of like lived experience things of basically like when your neighborhood starts getting like fancy, like people, have stories of their landlord raising the rent, And so it's,
we used to have in BC, you were allowed to, so we had like a set rent control percentage, and then on top of that, landlords could also apply for a rent increase that was based on the local market conditions. So like BC used to actually have it written in law that landlords could apply for a special rent increase if all of the rents around them were higher. So I don't know how that fits into like pure market logic of you leave it alone kind of libertarian market shit. But it was until very recently, in the last couple of years, it was the case that landlords could explicitly get a special permission to raise rents based on local rent. So it's an outlier policy, I'm sure, and not exists everywhere. But here it was the case that having luxury rents go up in your neighborhood could be used as a justification to raise your rent. That's not the case anymore as of, I think, 4 years ago. But just an interesting case study.
Yeah, I think, the research on this is like, it's not a ton. It's somewhat conflicting. For example, there's a study by the Furman Center that a lot of yimbys will cite a lot, that like the Furman Center is NYU. NYU is a super large landlord in the city. So, they have their own interests and stuff. I'm not saying it's fake or whatever. I'm just saying that like, I don't think that there is enough research on this yet. There's not enough studies. There's a few, but there's not enough to like completely disregard the experience of all the people saying like, hey, actually these luxury units that got put up next to me, like my landlord responded to that by raising the rent. Like these people will kind of talk about it like believing that like a rent increase is something that can happen when real estate companies remake your neighborhood. They talk about that like believing that is akin to being like an anti-vaxxer. But I don't think that there's enough research that it's that settled yet. You know, like I do know a lot of people and have personally also had it happen to me where like, you know, the transformation of a neighborhood did result in a rent increase. And to me, we're going to need more research on this before I think it's fair to definitively say one way or the other, especially because some of the research, like Anthony Damiano's research, is showing that, like, no, actually, it did result in a rent increase. And I do think that we should conduct like large and comprehensive studies on this, but there isn't that in any kind of definitive way at this point, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think a lot of the arguments in favor of it's a thing that happens in economics a lot where there's the sort of logical basis of these things. You know, if you increase housing supply, then housing prices go down, supply and demand. It's like a basic graph, you know, one goes up, one goes down. And then when it starts crashing into like real world scenarios, then if something matches, then you can like use that to lend credence to your theory about how it's going to work out mathematically or logically that you had before. And then if something doesn't match it, then you can like find some aspect of the situation to blame for like why it didn't work out in this case. Oh, there was too much restriction here, or there was this other thing happening there. Like when they talk about these outlandish amounts of building that they want to do or that they think will happen if we just get out of the developer's way, part of me feels like it's like an excuse at that point to then be able to dismiss the real world impacts of these things when later that many units didn't actually end up getting built. And they're like, well, yeah, of course it didn't work. Like we didn't get out of their way hard enough. We didn't offer them enough incentives. We didn't.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
We didn't cower the developers' feet enough.
Yeah, I think you're right that there always is, like, this isn't a perfectly designed experiment, you know, where they're like, okay, you know, my hypothesis is that you build 100,000 new units and then the rent will go down by, you know, 1% or something. Like, there's just no way to do like a study like that, you know, with like no other factors, like no other like interest
Places
rate.
are so different from each other too.
Places are super different. And I think, you know, one point that's very salient in the debate about yimbys is like that this all comes out of San Francisco, which is a few things. Like San Francisco is a super freaking tiny place. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast, so I said freaking, but yeah, it's like San Francisco.
Feel free.
Yes.
Go wild.
San Francisco is a very small place. You know, a lot of San Francisco, the zoning ordinances are an obstacle there. Like there's, you know, like a kind of a large single family home area where you can't build apartment buildings. And, you know, housing is really expensive there. There's also like the tech boom there, which just poured a bunch of new people into the city kind of all at once, like over like a 2 to 3 year period. And then, you know, the housing prices started going up, you know, a lot. And there was just a ton of evictions, a ton of displacement, homelessness. And the tech industry was really getting blamed for this, rightfully so, I think. I think that they should have had a plan for, you know, housing their employees. If they're going to move that many people into a city, they should have, at minimum, paid their taxes and advocated for affordable housing production. You know, obviously that's not going to happen. That's kind of a fantasy. But so basically, YIMBY starts because, like, I think around 2014, 2015, the way it's told is there's this lady named Sonia Traus, and she is like an anarcho-capitalist type, and she is a school teacher. Now, in the real version of this story, like, she was a teacher, but also like her dad's a landlord and she's a landlord. So basically, like, she had this idea like, hey, what if we just rezone everything and like produce as much housing as possible? We're going to turn San Francisco, you know, into this whole high-rise city. And the tech guys, they hear this idea and love it. So Jeremy Stoppelman, who's the CEO of Yelp at the time, he had just gotten called out around, like, I think it was 2014, might have been 2015, but I think it was 2014. So this woman that is like a lower level employee at Yelp, she writes, I think in the Chronicle, it might have been another one, but I think it was SF Chronicle. She writes about how she has a job in San Francisco that's considered an okay job and she still can't afford housing. So people started asking questions about the housing situation, and the tech guys started getting some shit for what they had done to the housing market of San Francisco. And so he makes a large donation to Sonia Traus, which establishes the first YIMBY organization. At that time, it was called SF BARF, Bay Area Renters Federation, which is so funny, but eventually evolved into SF YIMBY. I think it's had another couple names in there, but the tech dudes started like pouring money into this idea. And, you know, California really becomes like the kind of hotbed of this type of thinking, and it's really evolved over the years, and it's all sort of like coming out of San Francisco, which has this whole sort of other ingredient in it, is that like some of the tech guys in San Francisco, actually a lot of them, have really strange politics. Like obviously Peter Thiel is, you know, very known for being like the libertarian billionaire, and he like funded the Seasteading Institute, which was like an exploration of homesteading the open sea so that libertarians could do whatever they wanted in international waters, which my understanding is like mostly involved them wanting to do like medical tourism, like go to have, you know, unlicensed dentists or something. Like it's like the stupidest version of utopia that you could possibly make. But, you know, then there's like other ideas that are coming out of the Bay Area that are very strange around AI, not just the technology itself, but, you know, stuff like long-termism, which is a philosophy that says the way to make moral decisions is whatever will benefit humanity in the future. And it sounds like it's going to be about climate change, but it's not. It's like past climate change. It's like getting people who are uploaded into the cloud to live in outer space like 10 billion years from now, which you can't even like imagine. And there's effective altruism, which is like donate to the places that can get the most value out of the donation, which like in the good example of that is like mosquito nets. Okay, they're $5 and they can save, you know, a ton of lives really easily, you know, so that's like effective altruism, like working at its best. But then effective altruism, you know, at its worst is going to say, hey, we need to prioritize the life of like people in higher income countries because they're going to have the opportunity to like make more of a difference. And it can end up being this really sort of like eugenicist, utilitarian calculation of like, maybe you wouldn't fund an organization that helps people who had medical issues or whatever, because it's like, oh, you know, they're going to die anyway. And it just ends up being like this kind of super econ logic and also an excuse to like do something like immoral or unethical with your life, like be like a hedge fund guy because you can like donate all the money instead. And then there's even other really weird things too. Like there's this billionaire called like Balaji Srinivasan, I think is his name. And he's advocated for like ethnically cleansing San Francisco of non-tech people. Very, very strange plan. And, you know, all of these politics, because it is coming out of San Francisco, like not every single line of thinking, but the basics, like the tech guy libertarianism, the like extreme utilitarianism, it gets very like mixed up with like the culture of the YIMBY movement and also the funders. Like all the YIMBY orgs at this point are pretty much funded by this nonprofit called Open Philanthropy, which is a Facebook billionaire, Dustin Moskowitz, who also founded Asana, I think. And he is like a long-termist guy, and it's an effective altruism org. And so like just culturally, like the politics that become part of this community, even on things not related to housing, like one thing that's very concrete is the attitude towards policing unhoused people. This like hard right stuff gets really mixed in and kind of makes its way even through other YIMBY orgs who are outside of San Francisco, because it all started there and because like these guys, these super, super rich, like billionaire and multimillionaire dudes don't want to look at unhoused people, and their entire politics is based on I should not have to look at unhoused people, and they're setting the culture of this movement and they're also paying for it.
I run into a lot more lowercase y YIMBYs now, people who are interested in basically making sure that the amount of housing supply in cities increases over time to accommodate a growing population and so on.
Yeah.
And that's like the Mott and Bailey kind of argument. Like that's the approachable thing. Like who doesn't agree with that? You know, if your population is growing, you should have a corresponding growth in available units. Obvious. But then a lot of weird stuff gets bundled up in that. In the connection to the Tescrial kind of stuff that you're talking about, the transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism, turned into an acronym Tescrial, which is all these like pseudo-eugenicist movements out of Silicon Valley. It connects to that. And there's this whole spectrum in between of that common sense and the most extreme thing of like, just, yeah, strange assumptions and arguments about why housing is the way it is. And that appealing, broad thing of like, we should increase the amount of housing supply over time to match growing populations. It gets tied to all these much more bizarre assumptions, like the housing crisis is this apolitical thing where the rents that are raised by landlords, the profits of landlords are invisible. That's just the cost of housing. It's depoliticized.
Yeah, they call them housing providers a lot of time. Landlords and developers are housing providers.
Oh,
yeah.
Our local YIMBY organization is called Abundant Housing. And I argued with someone from it about policy once on like Facebook or whatever. And they were just talking about like how wonderful it is when landowners buy multiple properties and then rent them out. Because they're creating more rental stock. Like, don't you value renters? Don't you want to make sure that... So they were like raising the status of renting as this like moral category, that it's so wonderful to be a renter.
Yeah.
That no matter the cost of the apartment, like anytime that someone is creating more apartments, whether the units are $5,000 or $6,000, doesn't matter. It's just wonderful because there's even more renters. We should thank these investors. We should thank the people who buy all these houses. We should thank the people who produce all this because they're creating more opportunities to have the wonderful life as a renter, because just renting is itself, this has this moral glow to it. We should all be so glad that our rent goes to pay down the mortgages of someone else. Like how lucky for us. We get to be authentic. You know, we're not like those sellouts who put money towards their own assets every month. We're authentic renters. So we have to thank these property investors for buying up all the properties and pushing up the prices to make investments because we get to be renters. Lucky us.
Yeah.
This was like an argument that was made to me by someone who is a policy person.
Yeah, it's that kind of, I think, touches on like, so like there's three ways that like YIMBY as a term gets used. One is just anybody who's a yes to development on any given project. That's like the original simple meaning. Two is like this kind of network of organizations, tech funded, and their fan base. And I guess, well, I was going to say there's kind of like four meanings. Like three would be like anybody who is into the idea of just having more housing supply, which I also don't have a problem with. But four is like it's a propaganda movement. And so you'll see like these kind of crazy articles, in my opinion, crazy, talking about how, oh, it's actually not a problem that like private equity is buying up so many single family homes. Like that's actually good because then we have more renters. And the problem isn't Wall Street. The problem is your neighbor. I think that's an actual title of an article that was in The Atlantic or something very similar. And so it serves as like a propaganda movement in like centrist liberal publications like Vox, the New York Times, The Atlantic, podcasts like The Daily, to kind of like launder the horror, in my opinion, of the financialization of housing, and of housing not just being about having to make a profit for a landlord anymore, but also for shareholders, you know, like the kind of increasing involvement of Wall Street and, you know, these like mega corporations like BlackRock owning so much housing. And I think on an intuitive level that pisses people off. Like it sounds really evil for BlackRock to own a bunch of housing. It sounds really evil for Wall Street to be buying up a bunch of single family homes. And that's definitely the trajectory. Like I think that a YIMBY, like someone who's super bought into the whole thing, will be like, well, yeah, they don't actually own that much housing. It's not a major factor in driving up the price of housing. And on a nationwide level, like specific markets aside, that's probably correct at this point. But the trajectory, though, and like the way that it's going and like the speed at which they're purchasing and the increasing amount of housing like in the US that is owned by private equity is really horrifying. And I think that is something that like YIMBY is kind of like a propaganda to excuse, as well as like, you know, we just saw this landlord collusion software, RealPage, where basically like landlords had this software where they were able to set pricing by algorithm and basically create artificial scarcity by taking some units off the market and basically like doing like 20% rent increases higher than ever before. It's obviously like really shitty. They got raided by the FBI and there's a bunch of like antitrust class action lawsuits against them. So, you know, that's something that also people like intuitively think is really horrible. And even if RealPage gets in trouble, like there'll be a version 2 of it. Like there'll be something like that. Like landlords are gonna find a way to collude with technology because why wouldn't they? Like the opportunity is just right there.
It was interesting to see yimbys stand up for RealPage or try to downplay RealPage.
Yeah.
I mean, but they are right in the sense because they're saying, well, RealPage is only doing what landlords already do, just on an industrial scale. And then we're like, yes, it's a crime.
That's why it's bad.
And they shouldn't do it on the small level.
We're at war. War with the Silicon Valley techno-fascists. War against the land-owning industry. War with corrupt politicians, the Italian news media, and war against time and death. My name is Felix Bones, your dot connector in chief, as we explode the truth behind the headlines every day. Patriots, you have turned your radios to Narrative Wars, the home of the resistance. But first, a word from our sponsor. Felix Bones' Narrative Wars this week is brought to you by drinking water. Now, this could be bottled water, it could be from a tap, it could be filtered, unfiltered, you could add a little flavor packet to it or whatever. But the point is, if we want to take on the Illuminati, we need to make sure that our wheels are greased. If you're not drinking enough water, you're gonna get gummed up. As Felix Bones says, drink, 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 so they cannot access your brain waves. That's right, a dried out brain is an easy to access brain. Tinfoil hats block at 3.2%. A well-hydrated brain blocks at 64.1%. We've got the data to prove it, folks. Drink your water. Protect yourself against the Illuminati. Okay, folks, now here at the top of the hour, a bombshell report. The YIMBY movement, yes, in my backyard, is a front for a TESCREAL plot to enslave renters and eliminate democracy in society. Now, I heard these people talking, the YIMBYs. They're saying, we got to build more apartment buildings. I said, I don't see a big problem with that. And then they said, we got to build expensive apartment buildings so the other apartment buildings become cheap. And I said, now wait 1 minute. Doesn't quite make sense, does it, folks? TESCREAL. It's an acronym neologism. Stands for transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. This is the ideology of the Silicon Valley ruling elite, folks. It's these people who funded and continue to fund the deregulatory libertarian YIMBY movement, and they are a threat to our democracy. Some of these people genuinely want to eradicate democracy and have rule by a technocratic elite. And they say so openly. They want to use AI. Look it up, folks. I mean, this is real stuff. 100% sincere, not a bit. Look it up. They believe in ending democracy and put in place technological ruling elite, and they do have direct ties to the YIMBY movement. So our guest today, a doctor, a scientist, friend of the show, and verified by multiple test genius, is here to tell us about how we're going to fight off these TESCREAL, Silicon Valley, techno-fascist elite, and defeat the YIMBY movement. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you so much for having me on again, Felix. It is always a pleasure. Yeah, so a lot of people are taking a look at this YIMBY movement, at these Silicon Valley tech overlords trying to destroy our democracy, and they're saying, how do we stop them? And as a scientist, doctor, and genius, I thought, well, I should take a look at this. I should apply my thinking prowess to where it's most needed. I said, okay, what do YIMBYs want? They want to build housing constantly. So if we want to stop them, we have to do the opposite. Now, a lot of people think the opposite of building is not building.
Yeah, merely not building.
Yeah, but they're wrong. That's actually not the opposite of building. The opposite of building is destroying buildings.
Right.
What I'm saying we need to do is to go into our cities and remove housing, destroy all the housing units as much as we can, go in there, destroy until there's only one unit left.
So to bring basically supply down to the absolute lowest it could be.
Yeah, the lowest possible amount of supply. And that's the opposite of YIMBY, and I think that's what we need to defeat them.
So now, how does this generate affordable housing, or how do people live, I guess?
Yeah, well, it wouldn't generate affordable housing. It really kind of undermines the whole idea of what's being asked here.
Problematizing it.
Think about it like this. Humanity has existed for hundreds of thousands of years on this planet. And how long have we been building housing as we think of it in the modern sense? Not
Right.
very long. A few thousand years. Humans lived just fine before housing. And now everything's gone to shit since we started building housing. So I'm just saying, get rid of housing.
Turn everyone homeless? Well, where would people live?
Well, yes. I mean, technically, we're turning everybody homeless. But think of it like this. People have been quote-unquote homeless or unhoused for most of human history, and it was fine. Being homeless is bad because nobody's homeless. If everybody was homeless, we would work together on making being homeless good. I mean, think of it like this. Housing isn't natural. Nobody's born with a house. Like, it's not like, push. Oh, there's the baby. Keep pushing. Here comes the baby's house. No, that's not how we're born.
Now, in your proposal, you don't just propose to abolish all housing. It's to abolish all housing except for one. So what's the basis for that? How does that help people?
Oh, well, see, that unit is for me because I don't think I could do it. Not having a home to live in, like, it would be rough. I really
hard
like
to transition
my bed,
for you.
and I have sensory issues. I like to block out all the light, so it would be hard to do that without a home. And if it gets really hot too, I like to turn on the AC.
A provocative proposal today from friend of the show. Thank you for coming on. I don't know if I agree with him on everything, but he makes a lot of sense. You have to admit he makes his points. After the break, have we solved the historical question of language acquisition? Nanobots sent by aliens teaching us to speak. Stay with us.
Seriously Wrong is an independent, listener-supported, utopian podcast. And we rely on the generous donations of listeners like you to keep on going. So if you like the show and want to support what we do, head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/seriouslywrong and sign on up for just $6 a month. That's all we ask is that sweet $6 to keep the lights on and those podcast machines chugging along.
We turn down offers from advertisers all the time because our listeners are awesome and they're generous in supporting the show, and advertising is a form of mind poison. And that Sweet 6 will also get you access to our bonus episodes, a Discord server, and you also get our episodes before anyone else. Your contribution will help keep Seriously Wrong going for 1,000 episodes.
That's what the projections say, that after 1,000 episodes, I don't want to make any promises, but maybe I will. Maybe I'll just make the promise that if we hit 1,000 episodes, there will be 10,000 years of world peace.
That's just objectively factual. That's like talking to a doctor. Like, that's what a high level of epistemology we're dealing with.
And that's a promise. That's a guarantee.
I have some stats here about large-scale landlords. Testimony by Matthew Desmond. I'll link it in the description. He testified in Congress. In the United States, institutional investors, like large-scale investors, they raise rents more aggressively, use evictions more, and do less maintenance. In some areas of Atlanta, almost a third of rental properties are owned by these institutional investors. A House subcommittee found that 4 institutional landlords filed 15,000 evictions during the CDC's eviction moratorium. That's 4 landlords causing 15,000 evictions during a time that evictions were banned. Areas with more large-scale landlords investing have higher rent prices, suggesting that they probably push up rents. And large-scale investors also use their profits to lobby against things like rent control and tenants protections, often spending millions of this rent money, changing the political system to benefit themselves. And then on top of that, a lot of buildings, we actually don't know who owns them. This is the same in Canada and the United States. They're owned by shell companies, LLCs, and there's evidence showing that housing that's owned by LLCs deteriorates faster than housing that's run by sole proprietors. Cleveland-based study found that out-of-state investors are 5 times more likely to be delinquent on their property taxes. And according to the book Capital City by Samuel Stein, in 2016, the United States set a record with 37% of housing sales going to absentee investors. So that gives a picture of the absentee investor, large-scale landlord situation in the United States. It's very similar in Canada as well.
Yeah, I know, especially in Vancouver, which is, I think, like a market kind of like San Francisco, where it's just like super hot and housing is really expensive.
They're both about 45 square miles.
Yeah.
And Austin is about 350 square miles or 320 square miles. Gives an example of some of the differences between these markets.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of different factors driving up the price of housing, a lot. And some of this stuff, it sounds, very comic book villainous, like RealPage, or like these hedge funds buying up homes and jacking everyone's rent up. And it serves a very important function for capital to have basically like the liberal readers of all of these publications and centrist podcasts, hearing like, oh, this actually isn't so bad. This isn't a problem. And, like the Vox reader, okay, like that's not everyone, like that's a very specific audience, but the people that are reading that kind of stuff, they are the decision makers. And, it also gives politicians like the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, or the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, the YIMBY narrative gives them a way to sound like they're doing something about affordable housing while actually not doing anything about it at all. So as a narrative, it is a tool that I think effectively crushes any sort of talk of actual housing justice, not of everybody, but like in the minds of these kind of like well-educated liberals that end up being in a lot of positions of power in our society, making a lot of the decisions.
Yeah, and failures in the housing market impact people a lot. Like pregnant mothers who receive evictions have higher levels of adverse birth outcomes. There was a study in the US that found that for every $100 rents go up on average, homelessness increases by 7% in the city. And supply ideology of building these upper middle class units is insufficient to address a situation where you have these multiple layers of harm that are being caused by a housing system that's designed to exploit tenants for the benefits of landlords.
Yeah, can I read you something? Just a quote from Angles that was really mind-blowing to me when I read it.
Absolutely. Anytime.
So yeah, you're like, you can bust out Angles in this podcast. So this is him writing in the housing question. I'll Google the year after, but it was sometime in the 1800s, I think. How is the housing question to be solved then? In present-day society, just as any other social question is solved, by the gradual economic adjustment of supply and demand, a solution which ever reproduces the question itself anew and is therefore no solution. How a social revolution would solve this question depends not only on the circumstance which exists in each case, but also connected with still more far-reaching questions, among which one of the most fundamental is the abolition of the antithesis between town and country. As it is not our task to create utopian systems for arrangement of the future society, it would be more than idle to go into the question here. But one thing is certain. There are already in existence sufficient buildings for dwellings in the big towns to remedy immediately any real, quote, housing shortage, given the rational utilization of them. This can naturally only take place by the expropriation of the present owners and by quartering in their houses the homeless or those workers excessively overcrowded in their former houses. Immediately, the proletariat has conquered political power. Such a measure dictated in the public interest will be just as easy to carry out as other expropriations and billetings are by the existing state. So he's talking about it. Obviously, this is way before, like the modern sort of zoning ordinance system, but like housing is kind of like at the core of capitalist relations. And so I do think that part of the propaganda for this and part of the reason that the YIMBY has picked up so much steam, especially since 2020, it is because of the housing crisis, but it's also because, young people got very interested in public solutions to things, especially through like the Bernie Sanders campaign. And it became really normal to ask questions about like, hey, can we tax and spend to fix this? Like healthcare. And, you get just a lot of young people, embracing the idea of democratic socialism And, all of these kind of centrist think tanks started like trying to be cool to young people. Like, like there's even a Reddit, like R neoliberal or neoliberalism or whatever. And so like a lot of this is about housing, but like some of the propagation of this narrative is to like sell the young kids on neoliberalism again, and like the power of markets, like just sort of directly in response to the increased interest in socialism.
It's always struck me as weird that the housing debate never, again, it's always framed between like YIMBY, NIMBY, these two sides of the imagined debate. But like when you look at healthcare, which you mentioned, the debate is about in Canada, we already have mostly socialized healthcare. They're actually adding dental care for people who earn under 90K like next year, hopefully. But like the debate around healthcare in the United States is like, should we have a single payer system? That's at least on the table. It's like a discussed thing. It's been discussed for decades, but having a nationalized housing, even like a public option, that's like the moderate choice in healthcare, is to have like a publicly funded option for healthcare. That's like the centrist like Obama thing that he was putting forward, that he couldn't even get that passed when they made Obamacare. But like no one ever even talks about like a public option for housing, where like what if in every city we built enough social housing so that people could choose for themselves, and like it would create competition for landlords. They'd have to compete against the public option, and public option can be set up in such a way that it's affordable, like it's actually affordable to the people who need to live in the city. So whether it's based on their income, like 15, 20, 25% of people's income if you get into social housing, or it's based on some other metric of actual affordability, creating, publicly funded housing just as an option for people. We don't even have to go full socialism, it's just within capitalism, like a good social democrat, we want to provide a public option for housing. Like that can't even be put on the table because everything's framed around like this YIMBY debate.
Yeah, and it's exactly what we need. Like I'm a socialist and I would love it if we had, 100% social housing. But for now, like within this existing capitalist system, like what we do need is basically entirely what you described, is a public option for housing. And what YIMBYism is as a movement, the comparison that I sometimes make, it would be like if insurance companies funded a bunch of nonprofits to push the idea of deregulating being able to sell insurance across state lines as a cost-cutting measure. And it's like,
and then people on Twitter cheer for it. Like, it's going to be so much easier to provide healthcare now. Hooray!
And it's like that may not be a bad idea in and of itself. Like I don't know. Like I'd have to really sit down and like research the pros and cons of it. Like maybe it would be fine to make it so that you could buy insurance from any state. It's not like I don't have like a blanket opposition to the idea, but it's like if insurance companies poured like a ton of money and propaganda muscle into putting out this narrative that like, hey, that's the solution to healthcare, and they did it explicitly with the goal of preventing people from considering stuff like Medicare for all, then it would become more sinister, like it's like the idea of like changing zoning ordinances, fine. Like there's a lot of places that I'm sure it would help, and zoning is definitely some factor in how we got into this situation of super high housing prices. Like, but I think it's natural when any society gets to a point of like a crisis of capitalism, like housing prices where people are spending 50% of their income, and a lot of people don't have housing security, and like there's just massive homelessness. Like it would be normal for people to start asking questions like, hey, do we need a public option for housing? And these real estate, but also tech CEOs poured millions into these organizations. And now if you talk about, anything other than a free market solution, it's treated like, oh, well, you're a dum-dum and you just don't understand. I think that what could solve our problems at this point is probably like a wide mix of things. One would be like a public option. Two would be like additional tenant protections. 3, might indeed be rezoning, but it's very industry driven to like really try to get people to shut up about any other things that might be involved in solving this problem.
Yeah, and there's aspects to the YIMBY arguments that they're fine, like single family homes do take up a lot of space and they do have a lot of like political capital compared to renters. And so like some of that is totally fine, but upzoning as an affordability tool, not just upzoning for increasing density to match a population, but upzoning as an affordability tool with the idea being that we're going to undertake an unprecedented amount of construction using steel and concrete and resources and burning CO2. And we're going to produce just so much housing that the market is going to spend itself into making less money. And that this is going to be our pathway to affordability is wrong. Logically, it's wrong economically, and it's wrong environmentally. Like our affordability tool shouldn't be building way more than we need.
Yeah.
And that's what the thesis is that we need to build way more than we need so they drive their own prices down.
Yeah.
And I think it's much superior to look at, like we're talking about a public option here. And there's all these advantages that even before I became a socialist, I was really fascinated with the question of housing and public developers and stuff, because the government sets the rules. Like as a provider of housing, the government has every advantage over private industry in order to create affordable housing. Like sometimes you'll see YIMBYs citing, study as like what on a new build, what percentage of money comes from different places. Like this is construction costs, this is interest, this is the developer's fee and stuff. And I spoke to one recently and he was like, the developer cost is only 11% of the final rent. So greedy developers, it's a misnomer. It's mostly it's 40% construction costs and 12% or 11% developer costs. So like, don't you see how wrong it is to attack developers? And it's like, dude, 12% of my rent is a lot. You can cut off 12% of my rent right now. Like all of the things that public developers can avoid in costs and lower the cost of rent, you add it all together and it's pretty significant. It's like 30-40% of rent is stuff that can be cut out by working on large scale systems, like working on having set standard designs that are used, building on public land. And then also the government has the ability to procure itself more land at discounted rates using various legal and financial mechanisms. Like, for example, if someone stops paying their property taxes, then that plot of land is at the discretion of the city to use. They typically sell it, but they could develop it.
Yeah. And also they can give themselves really low interest loans, no interest loans. They can, if it's talking about the federal government, they can literally print money, like it's not.
They can give themselves zoning overrides. So you don't even need to upzone. You can just build public housing anywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
They can operate not at a profit. Like they don't, you can earn a profit. You don't have to. Like you can actually even operate at a deficit if it's a government funded institution. It's part of what government does is provide services that are paid for. Like
healthcare, it costs the government a bunch of money. Like government collects taxes and then they spend money on healthcare in Canada. And then as a result, we get reliable access to healthcare without having to pay monthly insurance like people have to pay in the United States. A similar principle could apply to housing that, yes, it could be an expense. It could be something that we have to raise tax revenue for. But the benefit of it is so great, which is that people have access to affordable housing in the communities that they care about, the communities they grew up in. Children can live near their parents. Seniors can live in the same community as their children. These benefits are really, really great. And so they are potentially worth functioning at a loss for. And that's something that no private company can do.
Yeah. And you also wouldn't public housing has a way to make money. Like you can still charge rent. Like if you're talking about, social housing, which is, I want to get into the nuances of that term in a second. But if you look at a city like Vienna, which even many yimbys will acknowledge is a city that has the most functional housing in the world, socialists built it. And, having most of the people live in social housing, it's not everybody, but it's a lot of people. I think something like 60%.
Yeah,
they set the market price. They set the standards for how tenants are treated. They, as the largest provider of housing in Vienna, even the people who don't live in social housing get a huge advantage. So obviously for very low income people, probably we do need to collect additional tax revenue to house those folks. And I have no problem taxing billionaires more, right?
Or do cross subsidy where you if you run market level units and deep discount units both by the same developer, and you use the rents from the market units to subsidize the deep discount and find an equilibrium, you can cross subsidize yourself without. There's a bunch of different models you can use to make affordable housing financially viable.
Yeah, and there is
and
cross subsidy. It is one way to make social housing financially viable. I'm not against it or anything. I think it's a good idea. But one thing to sort of watch for is increasingly you see some of these YIMBY organizations putting out proposals for their own form of social housing, which is heavily based on cross subsidy. But then you will look at the actual rent numbers of who can live there, and it's all market rate. So we don't solve the problem of housing the people who really need housing. And I would say it's totally fine to charge some market rate rents and to fund projects that way, but we can't evade as a society the question of how about someone who makes minimum wage? Do they have a place to live? And with social housing, I actually prefer the term public housing because I think it makes it really clear that the government is your landlord. Social housing can also be in some of these YIMBY proposals, you could have, a developer that is a nonprofit arm. It's basically just entirely the same as a market rate project. So I think one advantage in the term social housing is that people do have a really negative, in the United States anyway, a really negative association with public housing. It wasn't always that way. There's a lot of public housing in New York, Mitchell Llama, which is I think limited equity co-ops for the most part, where middle class people can buy in, and then when you move out, you get the money that you put in back. Your mortgage is just, you just get your mortgage payments back basically, but you don't make a ton of money on property value because you don't own the land, the city does. And so these were options that were widely discussed. Public housing was nice. It was somewhere that even middle class people chose to live in. And we still have some of those options in New York, but once neoliberalism started to take hold in the Reagan administration, then Bill Clinton furthered it. There was this starving of public housing of funds. And so, now if you look at NYCHA, which is the New York City Housing Authority, it's the largest public housing system in the United States. And they need so many repairs. There's people living with black molds. There's people living without heat in the winter. And it's genuinely really shitty, but it's been an intentional decision on the part of neoliberal legislators to starve it, and then to say hey, look how bad public housing is. Who would want to live there, And, I think kind of changing people's minds of no, we don't have to do it like this. We could adequately fund it. We could have mixed income. We could have this could be nice. It could be public housing that you see in Vienna or Paris or whatever, where the only way that you would even know that it's public housing is if somebody told you,
But I saw the rent bill.
Yeah, you saw the rent bill. But I think because of what we've done to public housing in the United States, people think public housing is going to be a really shitty place to live. And it just doesn't have to be that way. Right now, we're even privatizing a lot of the public housing in the United States and in New York in order to get the money needed for the repairs because the government will not fund it. It's being privatized, which is so shitty because then, people don't have the same protections, so it's just social housing can be a good way to talk about it as something that can get people sort of on board with a different kind of idea, but it can also be used to to just have market rate housing that is produced by the nonprofit arm of the same company. And I say public housing usually because I do think that it is really important that we actually address hey, where are our lowest income people going to live? I don't think that we should leave them out of this fight for housing justice, and the effort to elide that both on the part of the yimbys and even on some socialists to sort of say hey, we can sort of make something different. And there's legal reasons for that too, because Under Bill Clinton, there was a bill that had something called the Faircloth Amendment, which said that the amount of public housing that the United States has could never be higher than it was on the day that that bill was signed, which is, I think, in either 1996 or 1998. So we would have to repeal that amendment. But I think, like that would be like a great thing for socialists to put like a lot of energy into is, getting that amendment repealed and having, new laws that would allow the funding of public housing on a federal level and public housing construction and public developer and all of those agencies and mechanisms, like they still exist. It wouldn't be that hard to restart public housing production just like we used to. But this whole conversation about the market and like public-private partnerships and like, hey, yeah, maybe we'll have like a few affordable units in this super luxury building. Like it wasn't always that way. It was different even recently, and it worked better when there was public housing, and we should be looking to build on that instead of writing it off as an idea.
On the debate of what to call it, I'm involved with a local municipal party. I've talked about it on the show before, but I've just recently got re-involved with it, and we're strong on public housing, social housing. We're having this exact debate right now in our housing committee of how do we talk about it. Like social housing gets associated with only deep discount units and maybe that aren't getting the support that they need, or versus public housing. I like public asset housing at least as a tool in the toolkit because like the thing I like about including the word asset there is like priming the intuition pump of like when you build housing, that is something that belongs to and benefits the city and benefits the public. There's this great report called Building Our Future, Grassroots Reflections on Social Housing that we'll link in the description. They give a definition for social housing that I really liked, which is that social housing is housing that's high quality, permanently and deeply affordable for everyone, publicly or collectively owned under democratic community control, insulated from the market, i.e. non-market housing. And social housing can also refer to more than an individual building or housing complex, but a system of laws, policies, and institutions that helps make housing affordable and accessible for everyone, even people in privately owned residences. So I like this broad sense of social housing as like housing for social gain as a way of reframing it. I also like public housing in that it belongs to the public. Some of the other things that we've been floating is like, public option for housing is coming up a lot. And
I've always liked that one because it associates it with the less radical public option Medicare thing.
Right.
But like, I think ultimately like whatever suits the needs of the moment in terms of naming it is like less important than just actually getting the definition of what we want down. Like what thing do we actually want to do?
Yeah. What's the qualitative element here?
I love public option. I think I'll start using that term more often myself. I mean, like the only reason why I think it's important to make this distinction with regard to social housing is that the free market guys have figured out how to trick people. They have figured out how to make market rate housing that is privately owned and call it social housing as a way to launder the violence of the rest of their projects. I did want to say like one more thing about like the zoning conversation is like, they often talk about it in terms of like desegregating, which, zoning laws, a lot of zoning laws, the purpose was racism. It was absolutely white people trying to keep Black and brown people out of their neighborhoods. That's super real. And in some of those communities like Westchester, like it's still segregated. Like that horrible guy, George Latimer, that just won the Democratic primary against Jamal Bowman. Like when he was in office in Westchester, there was a federal consent decree that they needed to build affordable housing as a desegregation measure. And he refused to obey it because his constituents are like legitimate Nimbys who did not want that. And so in those kinds of neighborhoods, it is real. But the problem is this kind of discourse, they will also use it against people in lower income Black and brown neighborhoods who are fighting for affordable housing that they could live in, or even just to avoid their own eviction and displacement for like a luxury building replacing them, or the basically the state sponsored process of gentrification, of remaking neighborhoods to be richer and whiter in a way that is very reminiscent of like urban renewal that the US did, and was really violent and horrible and displaced like thousands and thousands of Black people, and, just devastated, a lot of like really important cultural and artistic institutions and communities and families. And they'll basically, when tenants are fighting for affordable housing, they'll levy this accusation of being like segregationists at them, which I just think that's so fucked up, basically, for like a white tech bro to, be calling like Black people segregationists because they are trying to stay in their homes. And it's like this propaganda movement to like make, gentrification is good. Gentrification is actually desegregation. The founder of the YIMBY movement, I'm going to look up this actual quote, but she's like, gentrification is returning Black land to its correct price. And it's like, dude, I mean, it's taking people's homes away from them is never like a racial justice project. Like, I mean, as in like white people trying to take Black people's homes away. Like, that's not anti-racist. And these people have gotten so high on their own supply that they talk about it like that. And how it pertains to zoning is like, zoning, as imperfect of a tool as it is often the only tool that communities have to extract some kind of concession from developers. So when there's like a zoning meeting, like a community can negotiate for like a few more affordable units, basically, or some kind of community benefit, like some green space, or, and to get rid of zoning in neighborhoods like that can just end up being very exploitative if it's not done alongside tenant protections and affordable units. So to me, it makes sense to talk about either, upzoning just wealthy neighborhoods, or maybe upzoning like a whole state or like a whole city, so that it doesn't just end up being like developers like predatorily targeting the communities where they can make the most money because the land value is the lowest and they have a lot to gain through the gentrification process of like getting those prices way up and walking away with like a huge profit.
Yeah, the history of like racist zoning, there is real stuff there, but then also there's a history of racist upzoning and displacement, gentrification and stuff. I can't remember which book it was. I read Capital City in the Tenant class, and one of them has this story of two kids in a neighborhood it's being renewed, urban renewed, and they planted trees and stuff, and then there's like this big for sale sign showing up or whatever. And one of the kids said to the other, this is the anecdote of like, see, I told you they didn't plant those trees for us.
Yeah. And that's why people oppose, like, sometimes you'll see communities, like lower income communities, oppose stuff that you would think would be like a no-brainer, like bike lanes. And it's not because people hate bikes. It's because they know that it's not for them. It's a way to raise the land price and the rents, and like basically like that it's going to result in their displacement from their community. And like, obviously that's really horrible. You don't want to say like, oh yeah, let's not, make things nicer or add a park or paint some stuff. But it's like, no, like you want to have other ways of preventing displacement other than like by not fixing things or not investing in it. And, for me, like I've read a lot about it, and I think that's, really strong tenant protections and social housing. But, when I think that like a lot of time, like the YIMBY conversation, it's brute force with like no sort of like thought to the fact that maybe sometimes people are opposing things for actually like very legitimate reasons, that the communities that have been disinvested in actually do deserve self-determination and an opportunity to like have some say in what happens to their life and their housing. And, it's like just... there's only two points of view, and if you don't have one, which is deregulate, let developers do whatever they wanted, nobody gets any input, you're a NIMBY. And it ends up being, like, I think really racist sometimes in a way that I think almost veers into alt-right territory.
Yeah, the flattening of the discussion, I think, is really part of what agitates me to focus on criticizing YIMBY arguments that I find insufficient above all the other things I could focus on is I do have a real genuine sense of agitation about having a complex argument be flattened to such a silly binary is either we're booing or cheering development.
Yeah.
And like someone said, like it's people say like stuff like this all the time when you talk about this stuff, but like it sounds like you don't support housing. Someone said to me, like, I don't support housing.
Yeah.
It's like that's like
You
saying
hate
you
housing.
don't support grocery stores. It's like saying you don't support phones. It's like just a
Yeah.
weird like I don't support housing without adjectives. I don't support weird or bad or ill-fitting housing. I mean, you shouldn't either. We just like, I love housing so much. You can build any sort of like, we're going to build this is the stupidest housing I can imagine. We're going to build a 500-story building where each floor is 1 inch tall and the staircase is going to be 2 centimeters wide, and that's increasing supply. This is my example of stupid housing that I wouldn't support. Yes, I support increasing the amount of housing with an eye towards affordability, and it's a complex discussion, like a wonkish thing that we could get into, but I find it really offensive when people try to like flatten conversations down into these binaries of like total deregulation versus never building any houses. I mean, it's just absurd.
Yeah. It is really dumb. And then, and they'll say stuff that's like completely disingenuous. If I'm talking about how we need to focus on building affordable housing, they'll be like, well, you're just a rich homeowner that doesn't want to lower your property values. And I'm like, no, I'm literally not. I'm telling you both my moral beliefs, but also my class interests. Like I am, as a person that does not come from wealth, interested in having a roof over my head when I'm an old person and I can't work anymore. It's like they can't even believe that anyone doesn't think that their idea is good for anything other than the most selfish reasons, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's so annoying too when people say that I'm like taking the side of single family homeowners, when I always specifically say that I'm in favor of some degree of upzoning for single family homelands, etc. Because also, not to get into like a toddler finger pointing match here or anything, but it is the YIMBY position that there should be blanket upzoning on single family homelands, which increases the land value of whoever happens to hold it right now. So property owners are materially benefited by the primary YIMBY agenda, the primary YIMBY policy, which is supposed to lead to the development of housing, but doesn't necessarily always lead to it. There's a study from Chicago showing that it didn't, at least in one circumstance. So it's literally a handout to the single family homeowners. The alleged enemy of the YIMBY movement gets a big chunk of money with their signature policy.
Yeah, and that's why I think, because of what you mentioned with like land prices, like sometimes you'll talk to people who are advocates for public housing production, and they see downzoning as potentially being a really important strategy because it lowers the land value. And then like the government has a way to purchase enough land for a program such as this. So,
and give yourself zoning override power, and then you don't have to compete with the market for the dense space.
Exactly. And it's like, to me, like, I don't think that in a place like New York, we do have like a legitimate supply problem. And, given the political realities at this time, no, I don't oppose all market rate housing, but I see what people mean. The more we upzone at this time, the harder it is to do it in the future. I mean, like Bill de Blasio, he sold a ton of public land to developers for like $1, literally $1. In my opinion, it's one of the worst crimes in the history of New York. It's just, he just gave away our public land. So this stuff has like some nuance, but I think, if you meet like 1,000 people who think about housing and know about housing, like you'll get 1,000 different perspectives on it, because it is a pretty complex issue. And the reduction of it to like 2 viewpoints of like complete deregulation or you hate apartments, it exists to serve capital. And that's why real estate investors and landlords and developers invented this framing, because it's so useful to them.
Yeah, they really don't want people to know that there is a third option. There's many other options, but at least one other option that should be on the table, that should be part of the conversation, should be part of the mix of tools that we're putting forward, is, I think, the expropriation of the present owners by quartering in their houses homeless workers or workers overcrowded in their present homes. I think it's
Yeah. I mean, expropriation is totally something that we can do too. Like, if you made me the housing dictator of New York City, like, if you're a landlord and you get 3 complaints against you for being a bad landlord, like, we expropriate your building, pay you for it at a, an okay price, but it becomes social housing.
One of the things they say about like tenant protections and why we can't have tenant protections is that like, it's going to push landlords out of the business. Those single family homes, they won't be buying them and then renting them out to people. There will be fewer renters or whatever. Tenant protections like just push developers out of the game. And it's like, well, if they don't see enough profit in it and they end up having to sell to the government for discounted prices, then like, fine. As far as I'm concerned, great. Like, I don't care if landlords are choosing to leave the market. If we're using that instead and replacing it with social housing, and the other side of that is like, we have to actually upkeep the social housing. Like, we have to not just let it fall into ruin and stuff. Like, have these oppositional governments that come in and let things fall apart. Because that's the whole other thing you brought up, is the way privatization works almost all of the time is that incoming governments defund the government institution and then say, see, it's not working because we didn't fund it. We better sell it off.
Jabroni socialism.
Doing that all the time. But
yeah, in wrestling, jabroni is a wrestler who's set up to lose. So we call that jabroni socialism. It's like a social program that's set up to lose, to be sold off.
Man, it is just really, really complex. With non-market housing, like, social housing is one way to do it. And I think it's probably the easiest way to do it on a large scale. But, there's other forms of non-market housing too. There's community land trusts. There's tenant opportunity to purchase. Those are kind of the main ones that come to mind right now. But people have thought about and written about many, many different ways of creating housing that is insulated from the market and is decommodified, is a break with that financialization of having your housing not only have to turn a profit for your landlord, but also for Wall Street as well. And to me, like, going from, where we are today to like something that works better, like, unless we have like a literal socialist revolution where we like seize the property from the landlords, I don't think we're going to do that anytime soon. So
at least a couple of weeks.
Yeah. I mean, who knows, man? It's getting pretty bad. That debate last night was wild. But, as much as we can increase the supply of non-market housing, it's great because then people get to live there and it does provide genuinely affordable housing. But there reaches a point where if the non-market housing is the largest amount of housing, then all of a sudden that's how the market prices get set too. And like, the more we move in that direction, like, the more beneficial it is. Oh, I was going to say, like, Elizabeth Warren, she had a plan in 2020. Her housing plan was basically YIMBY, but it was like kind of like bottom up / top down YIMBYism, where at the same time, there'd be rezoning and an increase in private construction. The US government, through an estate tax and also through cross subsidy, would build millions of affordable units. And so, like, you'd have the filtering happen in the opposite direction as well, which is even faster, right? Because it's always easy to get people to move to like a cheaper, nicer place. Like, it's much easier to get people to do that than it is, to have somebody like move from like a $4,000 apartment to like a $6,000 apartment that is not that much better, So it's just kind of like,
yeah, that filtering makes sense to me. I'm still honestly, like, broadly, if I know there's some evidence suggesting some degree of it, but I'm in like the filtering skeptic camp still, that you but that reverse filtering makes sense. Like, yeah, people are going to go for a cheaper apartment. You offer me a cheaper apartment right now, I will pay double rent for 1 month to get into it.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be one very kind of capitalist, market-oriented way that we could do it, which is, basically kind of like emblematic of like, Elizabeth Warren's whole thing of like, I'm going to have this like, very technocratic plan that is like a compassionate capitalism. Like, that's not my preferred solution, but that's an example.
Green the eugenics factory.
Yeah, that's an example of a solution. Like, the Green New Deal for public housing is something that has come up in the US a lot. And it started to kind of get talked about a lot in 2020, but then, it kind of dropped off, I think, when Bernie Sanders lost. And, also this YIMBY stuff coincidentally sort of like started to gain a lot of traction. But, the idea of like mass producing new public housing and also investing in the existing public housing that we have, to do the repairs that are needed to make it more energy efficient. If we did that right now, I mean, the good thing about a public developer, as you've been saying, is a public developer just has so many advantages over a private developer in terms of like they can add a bunch of units to the market at once. Like yimbys will talk about like COVID as this time where people got great rent deals, because a ton of people left places like New York. Like you could get like a really good price on an apartment during COVID. And so yeah, you increase the supply all at once and you have thousands of vacancies, and like through a terrible disaster, yeah, that can happen. You can get a bunch of apartments at once. But, if you're adding supply, over years and years, a little at a time, it has much less effect in terms of prices. Whereas the government could add like a bunch of supply at once because they don't care what it does to prices. Like their goal is lowering prices. So there's just a million solutions, maybe not a million, but, probably like 500 ways that you could like dramatically improve housing in cities. And the principles of it should always include housing people who are unhoused, like first and foremost. I think that's one of the things when you were listing like your problems with YIMBY, I would have added morally to that list. I think it's morally wrong to have something that you're saying is a solution to the housing crisis that does not include housing the people that are sleeping on the street and that as of today are going to be arrested and thrown in jail for sleeping on the street,
have
and
their possessions stolen from them or destroyed.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's such a nightmare, another like kind of bad faith accusation of these guys is they'll say like, oh, like, why do you want people to be homeless? And I'm just like, I always say the same thing to them. Like the second that you are advocating for housing that unhoused people can move into, let me know. I will join you. I will throw my full-throated support behind that project. But there's something very sinister about looking at this homelessness crisis that we have right now and just using it to lobby for luxury condos without actually doing anything for the people who need to be housed now. If anything, the people that yimbys elect to office, because all these organizations are, political organizations that fund candidates and get people elected. Those candidates, they're often sponsored by the real estate industry as well. So that comes with its own baggage. But one thing that it comes with, a lot of times they support an increase in policing because it is in the real estate industry's interest, in terms of property values, to have no visible homelessness. So it goes hand in hand with the cops. I mean, like we all remember like the very tragic and horrible story of the police shooting of Breonna Taylor and the gentrification of her neighborhood, the state-sponsored gentrification and the increase in policing that came with it to quote unquote clean up that neighborhood. Like, that's why the police were there. And that's another thing about yimbys that drives me nuts is they want to talk about the politics of housing separate from the politics of policing, but they always go together. It's the same politics, and you could theoretically have like a abolitionist free market housing candidate, but that person would have to take a pledge to take like zero money from the real estate industry. And like in reality, you see people like Scott Wiener, who is like the king yimby in San Francisco. He's like one of the most like, famous yimby guys in the country. And, he takes a ton of money from real estate, and he's come out with stuff in San Francisco, like in the middle of a huge storm, suggesting that the police in San Francisco like take tents away from homeless people. You have like all these YIMBY organizations in San Francisco that are these nonprofits, and they're called things like Together SF, Grow SF, Abundant SF, and they're all funded by separate tech or venture capitalists. And they all are about building more housing, but they're also all about like increasing the amount of cops in San Francisco and applying like very draconian punishments to people whose only crime is that they don't have a place to live, so that they can like remake the neighborhoods for, these richer people that want to come in and not look at people who don't have homes. So it all just really goes together. And I would say that even out of the housing stuff, like one of the biggest problems with with yimbys is they really don't think about the way that like police interacts with this, except to the extent that they often lobby for more police and fund candidates that come into office and advocate for brutal policing policies.
Papa and boy.
Papa, I need to talk to you.
Oh, what is it, boy? Here, let me just put down my newspaper and pipe.
Yeah, I have something to tell you. I'm kind of nervous. I'm nervous it's going to make you hate me.
Oh, boy, no. You can tell me anything. Boy, you can be yourself around me.
Papa, I've decided to become a yimby.
You just made me spit my iced coffee all over the cremated remains of your grandfather.
Yeah, I don't know why you had those laying out, but...
Boy, you're not a yimby, are you? My son a yimby?
I've been convinced by the strength of the arguments.
Oh, you know this is an AstroTurf movement that started out of Silicon Valley, right?
No,
The people
I don't care
advocating
who
for
it
this
started from. If the arguments make sense, the arguments make sense.
Boy, I'm not trying to make an argument by guilt by association. I'm trying to make the argument that there's reason to be skeptical that these ideas are what they claim to be.
And I'm just saying that if we want rents to go down, we need the vacancy rate to go up. And the only way to do that is to build a lot of market rate housing by upzoning. We need to get out of the developer's way, Papa.
Boy. This is a democratic socialist house. We advocate for a strong public housing program here.
Look, maybe ideally that would be great, but it's just not feasible in today's climate. What is feasible?
Handouts to billionaire investors. That's what you're saying is feasible. Handouts to single-family homeowners. Handouts to everyone except for the working poor, except for the people who need affordable housing. No, boy, I won't have this. I won't have a yimby in my house. You were going to renounce these ideas. Okay, a few things, boy. Number one, upzoning doesn't necessarily mean development. There's a finite building capacity. There's a finite amount of investment in any given market.
Sure, we also need to get rid of more red tape.
Oh, boy, red tape. You sound like a libertarian. How's this progressive? What are you talking about? Some red tape is good. The right red tape for the right reasons at the right time.
All I'm saying is that ends up in the rent costs, the red tape.
Boy, I know what you're talking about. In new developments, the amount of delay for projects increases the amount of interest that's paid by investment in the early stages and contributes to some small part of the overall final rent of new developments in particular.
Yeah,
I've seen these statistics. But then the YIMBY argument is that these houses are only for people who can afford them anyways, that rents aren't actually set by the expenses, but rather what the market will bear, and that this is being targeted at people who can afford it anyways. So even if you cut that red tape by YIMBY's own arguments, they're going to be putting them at the same market rates on the market for people who can afford them.
Papa, it's yimbys versus Nimbys out there. And if you're not on the side of the yimbys, you're supporting the Nimbys. And you know, all those single family homes, they have 15% of the population, but take up 85% of the land.
I'm not arguing in favor of single family homes. Boy,
functionally you are.
No,
if you're not
boy,
supporting yimbys, there's only
politics,
two sides.
there's more than cheering and booing. There's more than cheering and booing, boy. How many times do I have to tell you this? It's not just cheer or boo. Oh, I cheer for development. I boo for development. No, there's qualitative differences in the world, boy. And that's politics. That is politics. If you get rid of the qualitative differences of discussion and reduce it to cheering and booing, you lose politics itself. There's no room for discussion, boy.
When the rubber hits the road, either the buildings are going to be built or they're not. And your side leads to them being blocked for stupid reasons, like casting shadows on certain days or the views.
You know that I don't give half a shit about what buildings cast shadows where, when. I've told you this over dinner many times.
So why don't we have a universal zoning process and just get rid of all these useless hearings and take up all this time and slow down development?
Boy, I am open to discussing broader and alternative ways of changing the overall zoning system, but blanket upzoning that increases land values, gives a handout to single-family homeowners, and trusts the market to do its thing by itself without our intervention. No, boy, I won't support that.
It's not a handout. Upzoning decreases the land value per buildable square foot on all those
hypothetical
lots.
Buildable square foot.
Yeah,
oh
exactly.
my god! What? Oh, what a great expense for them. This is basically a Robin Hood program of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. What?
It makes it cheaper to buy a buildable square foot.
You're gonna buy a buildable square foot floating hypothetically in the air. No, boy, you have to buy the whole plot of land. It's extremely expensive and it's inaccessible for any investors except the biggest players in these overheated markets. You have to do something about land values, boy. Oh, I'm actually decreasing the cost per buildable hypothetical square foot. Boy, what are you talking about?
I knew you wouldn't understand me, Papa. You never understand me.
Look, boy, if you want to be an urbanist in this house, that's okay. Bike lanes, I'm all for it.
I'm an urbanist too.
Dedicated bus lanes, great. You know, getting cars off the road, great. I'm open to all these things.
Walkable cities.
Walkable cities, sure, absolutely. When have you ever known me to oppose walkable cities, boy?
Well, who knows with what I'm hearing out of your mouth today.
These yimbys are really rotting your mind, boy. They're turning you against your family. You've become a paranoiac. You're not able to have a qualitative political discussion anymore. You think that my personal opinions on building social housing is somehow blocking the increase of market housing, so you're advocating for deregulating millionaires and billionaires to run roughshod over our community.
If you want to build social housing, you gotta upzone it first anyway. You can't build social housing if it's just single-family zone.
What are you talking about, boy? You're talking about increasing the cost of doing that. You can give social housing zoning override if you're committed to a social housing program, boy. Get your head on straight, kid.
Oh, I can't wait till I'm 18 and I can move out. Stifling in here, Papa. You can't.
Well, great. Well, if you get your way, boy, you'll get a $50 discount on your $5,000 rent. All we have to do is pave over all of the parks in the city and turn them into $4,000 luxury units.
Oh, now who's a paranoiac?
Yimby boy. It's rhetorical, boy. Look, surely you can agree with me at the very least that if political conditions were right and we built a big movement and we had the capacity to fight and win these things with elected representatives, that it would be preferable for a massive increase in supply to come through rent geared to income, social housing aimed at the vast majority of the population. Let's say the bottom 90% of income earners could get rent geared to income housing in the neighborhoods that they care about and not be pushed out of the city. Social housing is the very least preferable to blanket upzoning market housing, right?
Sure, yeah. It'd be preferable if it rained lemonade and the
no, it wouldn't,
streets
boy.
were made of candy cane.
Those both sound horrible.
You know what I'm saying. I'm just
lemonade would ruin a lot of the outdoor accoutrements of our society. Not to mention the candy cane roads. That would wash away in one season, boy. What are you talking about? What if some child got lemonade in her little eye? And slipped on the candy canes, cracking her little head? Is that
Papa,
the YIMBY future that YIMBYs want?
Look, I'm not against social housing. If you manage to get social housing built, I'll be there at the ribbon cutting. I'll be cheering it along all the whole way. I'll be holding hands with you, saying this is great. And why can't you do the same for me?
I mean, I will work with you on certain things at certain times, but I'm going to have some political disagreements, boy. I mean, you shouldn't buy this YIMBY crap hook, line, and sinker, boy, and that's final. I want to see a little more nuance out of you. What about the tenant protections?
Oh, those will just cause rents to go up because developers won't want to build as much.
Oh my god, boy, you're a right-wing NIMBY. You don't even support tenant protections. A lot of YIMBYs these days are saying they support tenant protections.
I'm just saying they do more harm than good.
Oh my god, boy. What have I done wrong? Where have I gone wrong in my parenting to get this? My boy's a crypto-libertarian. He's a marketeer. He's a deregulator. I accept you, son. I may not understand you. It may be strange. And some of these arguments you're making I think are downright wrong. But I accept you. Because you're my boy. Papa and boy. So there you have it, folks. This has been a really great conversation. I just want to reiterate, landlords and tenants, we have different interests. One of us exploits the other. And the solution to the housing crisis isn't to tinker around the edges and assume that this is a functioning housing market that's only made a few mistakes along the way, but to assume that there's structural exploitation of one group by another here and then work to even out that field. And to that end, I thought maybe we could end, Kate, on talking a little bit more about some of the solutions that we advocate for. We've talked about them quite a bit, but I think that just putting together a little package of some of the hopeful things that can then happen would be a nice place to end people off. And one thing I want to mention, this is particularly pertinent here in BC and Vancouver. is vacancy control. Vacancy control is the type of rent control that ties the rent to the unit instead of the tenant. In BC, we had this very briefly in the 1970s. The Social Democrats put it in. It was rolled back by the Conservative Social Credit Party. For BC politics heads, you know what I'm talking about. Vacancy control basically says that if your unit is $1,000 and you move out, the next person is going to pay $1,000. This is one type of rent control that's a high priority in BC that tenants groups are working on. It's a great tenant protection I'd love to see. Another great tenant protection is giving people the right to return. If a tenant's unit is developed, that they should have a right to sit in the new development with a similar square footage, similar amenities, and the same rent. This is something we can require of developers to make sure that tenants are protected instead of being displaced when upzoning and development happens.
Yeah, I think those are great policies. I would add the right to counsel, that you get a lawyer. If you have to go to housing court, that the state provides you a lawyer, because the landlords always have a lawyer,
Yeah.
Good cause eviction, rent control, rent stabilization. It's still a private landlord, but, that affords the tenant some protection. Community land trusts, tenant opportunity to purchase, so that a building of tenants, they can become their own landlord, community opportunity to purchase. Inclusionary zoning, which we've mentioned. Personally, I think that's, it's not ideal, but if you have a developer building a huge development of luxury housing, yeah, we should make them add some affordable units if they're going to be allowed to do it in the first place, or alternatively, tax them substantially and then use that money to build public housing, which is an even better solution. But
another protection I read about, I need to look more into it, but it sounded really interesting, is eviction diversion programs, which is that when someone is going to be evicted, there's programs to get them on course to catch up on their rent and not be evicted. It's like adding an extra threshold before eviction, knowing how much eviction harms families, people who are pregnant, et cetera, children, creating systems that if someone is going to be evicted, that there's an intervention to help them get on track. My understanding is that eviction diversion programs actually work really well to reduce the number of evictions.
yeah, absolutely. Keeping people in their homes in the first place is one of the best ways to prevent homelessness. It has a really direct impact. And, I think that that's one area where we fundamentally see that the interests of developers and landlords, who are often the same companies and often the same people, that's one area where they just don't have the same interests as the tenants. And so to me, that's kind of, really clear area that yimbys are dishonest, because it's obviously it's in my interest as a tenant for it to be harder to throw me out on the street, because they just feel oh yeah, your housing now, should cost twice as much or whatever, so it's developers, just in New York right now, developers and landlords spent so much money against good cause eviction and watering it down and making it not apply to any sort of new construction for many years to come, and to not applying it towards quote unquote small landlords. But that's a sham, because as you mentioned, no one knows who owns a lot of these buildings. So a lot of bigger landlords, they can just have a bajillion LLCs so that they're small landlords instead of it's hard if you have a huge building, then you can't do that. But in terms of owning a few small properties, they can cook the books in such a way that, they can get out of the laws. And so to me, it's we should advocate for the best tenant protections that we can get. Organized tenant unions are great, and we should stand with them. And I think that we shouldn't worry about what the developers want or buy these arguments, so we need to capitulate to them. The best social housing system in the world is Vienna. And the way that it got so good, they had a socialist government pre-World War II, and they did set rent control so high that a lot of developers got out of the game. And then, they did exactly what you said. They developed, at a cheaper cost, and built the most successful housing situation probably in the modern world. So it's not, if we push these people to the point that they left the market, okay, the public can do it better. We can do it cheaper.
Yeah, no, like we need to build public housing or buy buildings that are currently not public housing and turn them into public housing and keep creating more public units until it is, if not a majority of the housing, then like a substantial minority, a real competition for landlords, a real option for people. And while it should prioritize the lowest income people first, people who are currently unhoused or people who are at danger of becoming unhoused or are on disability or earning minimum wage, eventually it would be great to create enough public housing that anyone can get into public housing and that the price can depend on how much money you're earning, but something that's truly affordable for all people. Like even if it's like 25% of income, no matter what you earn. So if you earn $100K a year, you'd pay $25K a year for public housing. If you earn $0 a year, you pay $0 a year for public housing. That would be kind of like an ideal system to me because it would, prioritize something where like anybody can buy into it. So it's not just a low income area. That was one thing I saw mentioned about the Vienna system that really works, is that there is a mix of different income earning people living in the same complexes, living in community with one another. But yeah, make it truly available, open to everyone. And the people who still want to be developers in that situation, who are forced to compete with the public housing system, fine. They can keep doing that. But if you want to get out of the game, that's fine too. You can sell it to the government and it's no skin off our back. Yeah, I don't know. Like all this capitulation to them and like bowing at their feet and saying like, oh, please, what do you need? What do you need so that we can, what else can we offer you to like build more of it? Like it's clearly not working. We've been doing it for decades. It doesn't work. I don't know. What are they afraid of? Let's give them a little bit of competition. Give them a public option to compete with the landlords and let the market do its work from there,
Yeah, and we need real change too, because a lot of the policies that yimbys advocate for, what happens is that these wealthy communities, they do have enough political power to reject upzoning, and so they don't get upzoned. And so what happens is these lower income communities do get upzoned. Well, guess what? They always have been. Like it's so easy for developers to do that to a community that has no power. Like Eric Adams, he's the mayor right now because he's the Brooklyn borough president, and he took a lot of bribes in the form of campaign donations from developers in exchange from upzoning. Like it's never been hard to do whatever developers want to a lower income neighborhood. So a lot of time what they are advocating for is literally what has been the status quo for about 40 years now. And look where it's got us.
Something that you said before, Kate, I think is really important about advocating for what is best. And this is something that in debates around housing, I find myself having to reiterate the meta premise about politics to some of these yimbys about, like, when you are an advocate in politics, you figure out what is needed and you advocate for that. So you advocate for what is most needed. So that's tenant protections, public and social housing. And the reason I advocate for that is because it's what's needed. And so often the question comes back to me of like, well, when are you going to start your public housing company? Or like, well, this is really more feasible right now because we can just politically, like, we need units at any cost and this is more feasible right now. And it's like, as an activist, my job isn't to advocate for what I think is most feasible in the sense that it's most likely to make powerful people happy and they're most likely to pass it through. And then I get to do a victory lap of, look, my side's winning. The rich and powerful are bringing my agenda to fruition because it was already their agenda. Yeah. Like, no, I'm going to advocate for what's actually needed. A real and deep solution to the housing crisis that we face involves income-tied social and public housing that is debt financed to have lower rents than market rents. We want to aim for 50% of the city or more of these rents, and we want to have strong tenant protections to make sure that landlords have less opportunities to exploit tenants, to soak tenants and take from them their livelihood, take the the livelihood of the tenant worker who is working 40 hours a week to support their kids, and the landlord is going to take a chunk of that labor time and in exchange for literally nothing except already being rich, apply that labor time towards their mortgage so they can have a multi-million-dollar asset. No, I'm not playing this game of, oh, let's advocate for some half measure because we're going to team up with the... No, like, what is actually needed is public housing and tenant protections and tenants unions. And we need to open up the books of landlords and make them make the case to us that their profit isn't enough, because that's what they're arguing. When they say, we can't afford to do this, or this is too tough on us, we can't possibly build this. What they're actually saying is we can't build this because there's not enough profit in it for us. They're not saying there's no profit in it for us. They're not saying we're going to do this at a loss. We're saying that amount of profit is not sufficient. So open up the books and show us how much profit is there. We'll figure out a rate of how much is sufficient. And then we're going to open up the books on all of the landlords in the city, find out what their expenses are, and we're going to make rents in relation to and in proportion to their actual expenses so people can afford to live in these cities.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the last thing that we won't get into a long discussion about this, but one concept that is very beautiful is the right to the city. And, you know, it's like the city belongs to all of us. And it's a place that we not only live in, but it's a place that we make. Like, it's our home, and we have a right to politically shape it and, you know, make it a place where people can thrive. And a lot of these, like, you know, kind of free market YIMBY discussions are about, like, well, you know, if people simply don't want to pay $4,000, it's because they don't value living in a city as much as somebody who does pay. And it's like this sort of like pretending that it's like the whole kind of capitalist lie that, like, why don't you simply get $2 million or whatever, you know? And it's like, I think that cities should be a place where working class people can live and thrive. And I don't think that cities should be Disneyland for the rich, where their servants have to bus in from the suburbs. This country and these cities, like, they belong to all the people that live in them. And that doesn't, I'm not saying that, like, rich people get no say, but, you know, they've certainly had like a disproportionate say. And we should be looking to increase the self-determination and power of those who have not gotten a say, rather than rob them of the small amount of self-determination community that people have really struggled to maintain in the face of, like, kind of a nonstop capitalist onslaught. And I think, you know, use our voices to advocate for the things that don't have millions of dollars in corporate lobbying money behind them. I trust that eventually there will be upzoning in all of New York. Like, eventually it will happen. I don't know when, but developers are spending a fuck ton of money to try to get that to happen. And it's like, I don't think my voice is going to be like the defining factor on that. Whereas
Your tweet stopped it.
Yeah. Well, whereas,
when
like,
you criticize yimbys, you prevented all the upzoning. You helped the single family homeowners.
yeah,
It was all you.
I know it's ridiculous, but, like, whereas, like, the people that really are going hard for, like, tenant protections in a city, like, optimistically, that might be, I don't know, 1,000 or 2,000 people, maybe more, but not a ton. And it's people with no power behind them. It's often people, like, that's literally their last option is political participation. And they're taking the day off work to go to City Hall or to go to Albany because that's the only choice. There's no other option left, you know? And who do we want to stand with? We want to stand with, like, the people that have the most money and power, that they can probably get their ideas implemented by, like, literally just bribing our legislators? Or do we want to spend our time, like, with people that are advocating for people that just, if we're not in it, like, there's not going to be anyone in it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's so right.
That thing about the value just bugs me so much. Like, yeah, though some millionaire values their third home that they're paying, like, you know, thousands of dollars mortgage on per month, far more than any homeless person who couldn't pay for that home would value it, because they, you know, if they valued it that much, they would pay for it. That's what value. Sorry, it's just such a.
It is so stupid. Yeah. But yeah, no, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's last name, but it looks like Henri Lefebvre, I don't know, but he wrote a book. It was about the concept of the rights of the city, which advocates that urban space belongs to us, not to market forces, and that our job is to take it back from commodification and capitalism and have it be a place that is governed by the citizens who inhabit it, for the citizens who inhabit it. And like, to me, I think that's a beautiful concept, that cities could be like a great sort of test case for socialism, and, you know, convince, you know, people even who don't live in those cities, like, hey, actually, like, public investment can do some really nice things, and democracy can do some really nice things, and instead of, you know, just turning up the capitalism to, you know, 5,000.
Yeah, no, super great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on, Kate, and suggesting this topic, something I'm really passionate about as well, and appreciate your insights on this topic, not just here, but on your Twitter as well, where you're active on these housing discussions.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you guys. I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, I'm kind of annoyed with the way that this stuff has been picking up in social capital over the last couple years, and like the prospect of some tenant advocate going on Twitter and saying like, I want rent control, and then getting some smug square glasses like, no, I'm getting paid $90K a year from real estate and Silicon Valley dark money to troll people on Twitter, and me and my 500 people are going to start shitting on you and acting like you're a dum-dum. It's actually really sick and annoying how much money is going into this. And it's really important that we have these conversations picking apart the limits of what they're saying and criticizing what they're saying. So this has been a really, really enriching conversation. Hopefully our listeners at home agree.
Thank you.
So where can people find your stuff?
So even though I wasn't super funny in this conversation, I am a professional comedian. So if you want to check out my comedy, I have a new special that is on Apple TV, YouTube, Amazon, you know, all these terrible tech companies. But
all the companies paying for the YIMBY movement.
All the companies paying for the YIMBY movement. If you're a socialist, why do you own a cell phone and have a special on Amazon? But, you know, and so I have a new special there. I had a podcast called Reply Guys that has a bunch of great episodes on YIMBYism and tenants' rights and urban planning, and that's still up. But I'm about to start a new podcast sometime in the next couple of weeks here that'll be like kind of a second chapter of that with, you know, maybe like a little bit of a broader focus. And yeah, I'm on Twitter at Kate Willett with 2 L's and 2 T's. I'm on Instagram at kate.willett, which is the best place to see, like, you know, my stand-up. And yeah, no, I love talking about this stuff. And I think just if I can make, you know, a couple book recs, the book that you were recommending by Sam Stein is so good. And also In Defense of Housing is a great book too, by David Madden and Peter Marcuse. It's a really, really short read, but it's also great.
Yeah, I really want to recommend again the Tenant class. Now, there's lots of great books on housing that I've read, but this is the one that is most clarifying in terms of stopping the depoliticization of the housing crisis and centering that the housing market is a place of systemic exploitation. And I just think that's
awesome.
So important. Well, yeah, thanks so much again. This is, I don't know what to say now. That's it.
It's literally going to party where we're saying goodbye 65 times.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of it is that I feel like I could just talk about this for another couple hours, but we have to not. So yeah, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.
And tenants, join your local tenants union. Find your social municipalist party. And if you live in Vancouver, consider joining the Coalition of Progressive Electors and send a little email to the COPE email account and just say that you came through the Seriously Wrong podcast. And then I will reach out to you personally following that because we're working on this exact issue right now. But bye, everyone. Bye.